Okay, it's recording to the cloud.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So some common visitation questions you might have. We sort of break these out into three big categories, and you'll be able to see how the different methods that we're going to talk about can get to different aspects of these. The first is we're often dealing with trying to assess levels of things. In this case, with visitation, that can be when are people visiting, so understanding distributions across time. Where are they going? Understanding distributions across space. How many people are visiting? With that, there's sometimes issues related to crowding. We'll dive back a little bit more into the differences between levels and sort of perception and how that influences crowding. In the behavior realm, we are often interested in understanding compliance with certain regulations we have. So that can be, to use some recent examples, compliance with some COVID related measures, ability to social distance or wear face covers when required. It could be compliance with other regulatory things, how to manage dogs on trails, how to comply with resource protection requirements like staying on trails, avoiding nesting areas, not harassing wildlife. There's understanding the types of activities that people are doing, modes of transport that they're using to arrive to the trail system. And behaviors all tend to be things that are a bit more contextually dependent, right? So not everybody takes the same mode of transport every day. Some people are quite compliant on some things and not compliant on others, or that may be contextual based on location or who they're with. Attributes tend to be things that are not completely immutable, but are generally a little bit more stable over time or slow to change. So demographics, understanding things like race, ethnicity, gender, residency, income, level of education, sort of the describing who in your community or from outside your community is interacting with your public lands, the attitudes that they hold. Attitudes can change over time, but they tend to change slowly. Maybe things like willingness to pay, whether or not people are willing to engage with a pay to park scheme or something like that. Preferences, those are related. They can be a little bit contextual, which is why they sort of move to that behavior side. Experience quality, that definitely overlaps with behavior, and the different experiences they're having. Perceptions can change depending on context, and you'll see in the middle there we have conflict. It's something that often comes up in certainly public land settings, but that really is, we're not going to get a whole lot into conflict necessarily today, but I just wanted to point out that that's really sort of an overlap of everything. The values that people hold, the what's going on in a particular area, that could be how busy it is or the types of behaviors that people are demonstrating in that area. So that's sort of maybe one of the most complex topics here that land managers often have to deal with. So Dion alluded to some of this earlier. These are some of the core principles we try and hold when conducting visitation studies. Purposeful inquiry, as sort of questions, management questions get filtered down to us. One of the big challenges for us is refining that into a question that has a clear purpose, which really in a lot of ways means that we can measure it, definitively measure it, and actually try and get some sort of answer to that question. Vague questions like, is are people having good experiences, right? That's, we have to break that down into much more refined questions that we can ask. We really try and keep all of our informed design is a big one for us, and it's, I'd say, relatively new in terms of a lot of visitation management, at least in the last couple of decades for public land managers. We really try, we tie as much of our stuff back to theory as possible, and so all of our studies are um, pretty heavily based in the scientific literature. Success measures, these can either be things that you are aspiring to or that you have, but when you're going to measure things, keeping in mind if you're actually going to try and integrate this into some sort of management scheme, like how are you going to know if you're succeeding or failing at a particular objective? And then finally, management cohesion. This is a big one for us. The success of a lot of our research is not based on the power of the statistical tests that we're able to run necessarily, but the ability of that research to improve management. And so we have to keep a pretty close eye on how on sort of the dynamics of how the management process is going as well, and understanding um, where we can plug in with a lot of this information that we're collecting. So we like to throw this up, the quick reality check first. In an ideal world, right, we'd be able to survey or count or observe or track everybody, and we'd be able to have a great representation of the entire population. Doing visitation research on public lands is, of course, far trickier than that. So really the goal is we just need to get enough data for enough people to get a reliable approximation of what's going on. And even with thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of visits a year, that is possible with the appropriate methods. We wanted to start off with a sort of quick overview of sampling methodology. Probably one of the most common questions we get, particularly with agencies that are new to developing their sort of visitation research programs or human dimension type programs, is really the struggle, of course, of resources. And for this type of approach that not exclusively, but really breaks down into sort of whether you're going to take a probabilistic or a non-probabilistic approach to collecting data. Generally, I'd say across the board, we always advocate for probabilistic for many of the reasons outlined on this slide, particularly those ones down there in the blue. Reducing bias, they're more generalizable, or at least we can say who they're generalizable to. And they also set us up for trend analysis over. So if we're able to repeat certain studies cyclically or annually, sometimes it's annually, sometimes it's every 5 years, but we're at least able to compare how those metrics are changing over time. Probabilistic sampling, of course, does take more planning. It takes longer to implement, often takes a little bit more staff time, and is a little bit more expensive, but the big trade-off there is that the quality of the product is typically higher. Although there may be certain cases where non-probabilistic studies are a reasonable starting point, you'll see that most of the methods that we're presenting here are based on sort of probabilistic sampling principles. So the last thing I will share before we get into the specific methods session or sections is just a quick overview of some of the things that we've been able to learn over time and recently. We've broken that. This is just a highlight of um, three or four major findings from the different methods we use. So for surveys, we've been able to understand things like we've got an aging population or visitor base. It helps us understand residency and the fact that still a large percentage of our visits do come from either city of Boulder or Boulder County. They're very regional, although we're able to see differences in where outside visits are coming from. The distributions of activities that people are doing. From a lot of the count research that we've done, we now know that we've got a pretty long recreation season. If anybody's familiar with some of the work that National Park Service or Forest Service does, they tend to get a pretty significant peak in the middle of the summer in terms of their visitation. For us as a municipal proximate open space, it's really, if the weather's good outside and conducive to recreating, people are out on the trails. We're able to understand our busiest times and how those change across seasons. That can inform a lot of management. We're able to understand total visits. So one number off the bat, our most recent study, we estimate that we get about 6.25 million visits a year. And so a visit is just a person visiting one time. So if the same person comes five times a week, that's 5 visits. Other hot topics, dog waste, and particularly compliance with picking up after dogs. We've got a lot of dog visits on open space. We guess somewhere in the ballpark of about 2 million dog visits a year. Dogs on leash, we've got a mix of off-leash trails if you meet certain requirements, other trails that require you to have your dog on leash. How compliant are people with following those regulations? And then more recently, we've been able to launch some observational studies on both face cover presence on our trails and the ability of people to social distance. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into the methods section. And after each of these sections, we'll have some time for Q&A. But the first one we'll start with is surveys. And so I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Heidi and Anna for that one.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Colin. So, yep, we'll dive into this first one, which is surveys. And overall, surveys are used for collecting self-reported data to gain information and insight into your topics of interest. So for each of these methods we're sharing about today, there are, of course, advantages and disadvantages to each of them. So there are times when one method might be more beneficial to use than another. So for each of the methods, we'll start the section off with when that particular method would be a good choice for your data collection. So surveys are a good choice when you're trying to understand self-reported characteristics, attitudes, beliefs, knowledge, or norms of a particular group. This method allows you to go directly to the subject and ask firsthand what you're trying to learn without any filters. Trending data collected through surveys is practical to measure if there's any changes over time or as a result of management actions. They can be utilized pre, during, post, or extended post to see if there's any differing outcomes after a management strategy has been implemented. This method also fosters trust and buy-in from those you're surveying. It helps build relationships by demonstrating you care about survey respondent opinions and truly value their input, and you're actually going to them and asking for it. And surveys can also what we call grease or myth bust squeaky wheels. So they provide the opportunity to get a more comprehensive snapshot from many and not just one vocal individual. There are times when one person or a group of people can be really adamant about sharing their individual experience and opinions. They're convinced that their experience is representative of everyone or that their opinion may be more important. And at times, these people can be really have a strong presence and be extremely vocal. So surveys can help prove if their experience is shared by many, or more often than not, disprove or share a different picture than the larger population's actually experiencing. So if we can go to the next slide, and in this slide, I'll be discussing the various different formats that surveys can be administered. So for each of these, I'm gonna briefly describe each of the mode of surveys and then just point out a few of the pros and cons for each. So the first is face-to-face interviews. These are directed one-on-one conversations that can range from casual to highly structured. A couple pros with these are you can obtain a high level of detail, and on top of nonverbal responses, you can also observe nonverbal communication. A few cons to these modes are that it can be extremely time consuming for the surveyor and the survey respondent. It's expensive, it requires a lot of resources, and analysis can be very time intensive. The second mode is telephone surveys, and these are also directed one-on-one conversations, but they occur over the phone. An advantage to this mode is that you can the respondents feel a bit more discreet when sharing their opinions. They often feel more comfortable being direct with their opinions because it has a more anonymous feel to it. Excuse me. A disadvantage to this mode are we live in such a transient society. Many people don't have phone numbers that are tied directly to where they live. So this can make sampling more challenging. Often, since, as we all experience, lots of spam calls these days, so people often screen their calls and don't pick up if they don't recognize the number. And oftentimes, there's a potential for a high number of incomplete surveys because respondents can end the call at any time if they feel the survey is going too long or something more important pulls their attention, then the survey can end quite abruptly. The third mode is mailback questionnaires, and these are usually a paper with a set of questions that's received in the mail. It's completed by the survey respondent and then mailed back. Some benefits to this method include question comprehension usually increases because the respondent can read and then reread if necessary the question to make sure that their comprehension is clear. They're able to think about their responses a bit more, and you're able to reach a population who might not visit your system, and sending a questionnaire directly to their home is the best way to capture their opinion. As for disadvantages, the response rate can be quite low and reminder mailings are often necessary. And there's also no opportunity for clarification if a respondent doesn't understand something on the survey. Participants may also return incomplete surveys, whether that be on purpose or not, it does occur. And the possibility of self-selection bias, who actually chooses to respond, increases with this mode. The fourth being hand-delivered questionnaires, and they're usually questionnaires that are directly handed to the respondent. Traditionally, this has been in a paper format, but now we're starting to see more tablets being utilized. Some pros include a higher response rate, and again, you can collect additional information through observation, such as group size and number of adults or children. As Colin pointed out, this is a method that's more generalizable, but it's also more resource intensive. So this is the preferred mode if you want to know about the people who are currently visiting your system and you have the resources to actually be able to do this. Finally, the last survey mode we're going to share today are web-based questionnaires. There's various different design platforms for these, such as SurveyMonkey, SurveyGizmo, Qualtrics. QR codes are also frequently used. So an advantage is that a survey administrator isn't needed, and it can be completed independently by the survey respondent on their phone or computer. But a disadvantage is that web surveys are usually not systematic and are more opportunistic. Sometimes links will get spread throughout social networks or group emails, and they can be heavily weighted by the groups that choose to respond or respond numerous times. So ultimately, the survey mode that you select is going to be dependent on what data you're trying to collect, the resources you have, the level of accuracy you want, and the intended desire to generalize your findings. So if we could go to the next slide. So we have 6 guidelines we want to share with you today regarding questionnaire development. These are not the only guidelines that you would want to follow when developing a questionnaire, but we felt these were the most important to share today. So we're going to start broad with what do you want to learn and know your audience. We'll get a bit more specific with design appropriate questions, keep it simple, use scales carefully, and then to overall going with the flow. So if we could go to the next slide, thank you. So we're going to start broad, and it's necessary to identify the questionnaires purpose. So you want to think about management questions and how can the data and the concepts that are captured in the questionnaire actually be applied to management decisions. The research goals and objectives will also help drive the development of the questionnaire. So once those bigger concepts are outlined, you want to define the specific variables you want to know. And this is really key to appropriately selecting and designing questions. You also want to identify and ask exactly what you want to learn, and you want to ask exactly that. So you want to make sure your questions are really getting to the heart of what you really want to learn. Don't make assumptions just because someone said, let's say they saw a lot of cyclists on the trail today. That doesn't mean that they felt there was too many cyclists using the trail. It just means that they saw a lot of cyclists today. Don't ask questions that you don't want the answers to. If nothing's going to change, don't pretend you're seeking feedback. If you're not planning on changing it, it really ends up creating poor relationships. And don't ask self-affirming questions. It's pointless. People can see right through this. Finally, you want to make every question count. Questionnaire real estate is extremely valuable. You want to make sure each question has a specific purpose. When considering if you should include a question, it's worth contemplating, will this question provide the information you're truly seeking to gain? As you can see in this comic here, it says, get all the information you can, we'll think of a use for it later. Nope, you don't want to do that. You really want to be strategic in the questions that you're asking. I also want to point out it's necessary to revisit these concepts throughout the questionnaire design over and over again. It's not a one and done process. You want to make sure you're really getting at what you want to learn. All right, so next slide. So moving into know your audience. Who are you intending to collect the data from? So once you identify who it is, you need to determine when and where you can find them. Are you trying to learn more about a larger group, overall visitors, versus maybe a specific subgroup such as cyclists or birders? Either way, you have to think of where and when this population will be available to survey. Another consideration is who are you including or excluding, and do you mean to do so? So for example, are you looking to capture the opinions of visitors or residents? And that could really drive if you administer an in-person questionnaire versus a mail-back questionnaire. Or maybe you're looking to survey adults or youth. Your audience may include non-English speakers. If this is the case, this could impact questionnaire design, or you would want to have the questionnaire written in various different languages. You also want to provide context instead of assuming respondent knowledge. You can't necessarily assume respondents know the topic you're talking about. So depending on what you're trying to learn from the respondent, you may need to provide context or additional background information. So for example, if you're asking if they're aware of a regulation, you may not need to provide as much background information. But if you're asking if they support or oppose a certain regulation, you would want to share more information about the actual regulation so they can provide an informed response. And finally, we'll go into that you want to pilot test with your intended audience. You can design a really great survey and you won't know how it goes over unless you pilot it. You want to identify potential problems prior to it going live so that you can remediate those. You also want to make sure it makes sense. There's readability and understanding of all the questions, and it takes the intended allotment of time. So jumping into designing appropriate questions, you want to consider the type of questions you're asking, of course, but you also want to consider how you're asking them. So the two main different types of questions we're going to talk about today are open-ended and closed or fixed response questions. So open-ended questions are broader, free response, and they require the respondent to develop a full, meaningful answer on their own. Whereas closed or fixed response questions are more focused, and they include predetermined answers from a limited number of responses. So those could include yes or no questions, true or false questions, categorical, rating scales, ranking questions. So an example of an open-ended question would be, what is your primary residence? Which would require a fill-in-the-blank type of response. A similar type of question, but would be categorized as closed or a fixed response, would be, what is your primary residence? And then a selection of responses are provided. So we live in Boulder, Colorado, or we work in Boulder, Colorado. So the answers would be, the selection that you could choose from would be Boulder within city limits, Boulder County outside city of Boulder, Denver Metro, other city, town, or county in Colorado, other US state, or outside of the United States. So you can see there's a fixed number of responses you can choose from, and all of the respondents should be able to fall into one of those options. So similarly, there's pros and cons to each of these questions. Open-ended questions are great for exploring a new topic and attaining new information you may not have asked for. It provides an opportunity for infinite responses, so your respondents can share exactly what they want to. It's based on the compilation of responses, and then you can draw out common themes. And then there's what we call event box, which is open-ended, where your respondents can share what they choose. And sometimes this can be a pro, but you also see that this falls under the con category as well. So jumping into cons for open-ended, it's time intensive to analyze. Interpretation bias can occur when coding, which definitely can invite scrutiny by the public or whoever you're sharing this information with. And then you'll see the last two are in both the pros and the cons section. So there's the opportunity for infinite responses, which is great because the respondent feels that they can share what they want. But with that being said, you can receive hundreds of different responses, which can really make it more challenging when comparing answers, or it can also take a really long time to code them all. And then, like I shared before, the event box as well. Sometimes people just use this as an opportunity to go off on whatever topic that they want, whether that have to do with the questionnaire or not. It can really open up for a rant. So pros and cons to both those. As for closed-ended, some advantages are that they are less demanding and time-intensive for the respondent because there's that fixed number of responses to choose from. They only have that amount. It's easier to analyze and trend, again, because of those limited number of responses. It allows for benchmark against cross-agency comparisons. So you can ask the same questions and provide the same responses so that you can compare them between different agencies or throughout different years when you're asking these questions. And then some disadvantages are that there's limited responses to which you choose to list, and that may lead to missed potential answers. Even if you think you've thought of all the responses, you might not be capturing everything, and respondents can feel limited in the sense that they might feel boxed in, that they have to choose one of the responses given. So oftentimes closed-ended questions are preferred. However, depending on the topic, or if it's a new exploratory subject, or descriptive answers are required, then open-ended questions might make more sense. Or oftentimes a combination of the two work really well. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it on to Anna to continue.
Thank you, Heidi. So I'm going to pick it right up with a few more guidelines, the first of them being keep it simple. And one of the aspects of this is to use multiple questions to measure complex concepts. This involves being really specific and intentional about what you want to know and avoiding double-barreled questions where you ask two things in one question. So one thing that we've used before on surveys is we wanted to learn how people rated trailhead signage. So one way to ask that is to straightforward just ask, how would you rate the trailhead signage? The problem with that is if it gets a low rating, you're not really gonna know what was wrong with it. So when we did ours recently, we asked how important was it and what was the quality. If we wanted to get more specific, we could have asked anything like, was it easy to read? Was it comprehensive? How was the placement of it? It all just depends on what you're trying to get out of it. Next is to use clear, concise language. Some people use a kind of rule of thumb to target a 5th grade reading level. So that could be a good target for you depending on what the content is of the survey. And then again, make sure you're piloting with the audience that you're interested in. It's great to pilot with friends, family, coworkers, but they all might be more familiar with jargon than you are. And so as much as you can, you want to pilot with your intended audience. Next slide is use scales carefully. So we all like Likert scales and they can be great, but you want to make sure that you're using and interpreting them carefully. So one part of that is balancing scale responses. It could be a little misleading. We're obviously giving a great workshop right now, but if at the end, we asked you to rate it and we provided 4 positive options and 1 negative, that would be a little bit misleading. So you want to make sure it's balanced on either side. You also don't want to ignore neutral, no opinion, don't know options. Some people decide to leave these out altogether and force people to pick a side, basically, which can be fine depending on the circumstances, but it also can be really useful to know how many people don't know how to respond or don't know enough information to respond to a question. If you do use them, it's just important to make sure that you don't just, leave out that group altogether. You can be missing some really good information with that. Next is to analyze and interpret with care. One of the main criticisms of scales is there's not really a concrete or equal difference between words like slightly, moderately, somewhat. They're all kind of synonyms for somewhat of the same thing. And one person's strongly agree doesn't necessarily equate to another person's. And it also doesn't always make sense to take an average of something between slightly and moderately. So a better practice is to look at the percentages of people who respond a different way or just the straight number of people who responded that way instead of taking an average. And then if you can, just avoid vague quantifiers altogether and be as precise as you can. So for example, if you want to know how often someone recreates, instead of saying all the time, frequently, sometimes, it's better to put time bounds around it and ask people to provide actual numbers. So instead you could say, how often did you exercise outside in the last 4 weeks? Was it 5 or more times, 1 to 4, less than 1? So as much as you can, use actual numbers instead of the vague quantifiers. All right, and then we're on to formatting. And surveys are a great place to use bold, all caps, colored arrows. Everyone here has probably taken a survey and chances are you probably skimmed it and people seem to try to race through and finish as quickly as they can or assume that they know what you're asking. So you don't necessarily have to use 5 exclamation marks, but it's okay to get kind of close to make sure people are paying attention to important instructions. Next is to group similar questions into logical sections. So start with something easy, interesting, relevant. The first questions receive the most scrutiny. So you want to kind of make sure you're easing people into the survey. Use transitions if you have a long survey with different topic areas. It helps you to keep a conversational tone and kind of a roadmap as they go through it. And then demographics, which often include sensitive questions. There's different perspectives on where to put these. We like to put them at the end because a lot of people will skip things like how much income do you make? And we don't want to get people in the habit of skipping questions early on. So we like to keep those at the end. Heidi mentioned our vent box. We're a big fan of allowing people to provide comments. If they're taking a survey, it's probably because they want to communicate something. And if you didn't capture that with the questions, this provides them an answer to, or a way to provide that input. And finally here, you want to consider the length and respondent fatigue. So this goes for the survey as a whole, as well as individual sections. It can be pretty tiring to go through a whole list of ratings. And another strategy for that is to kind of randomize the questions in there, because people might pay a lot of attention at first and then they'll kind of just circle average, 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 average all the way down. So you can mix those up, but try to keep it as short as you can to avoid respondent fatigue. We try to aim for less than 10 minutes to do an on-site survey. It can go a bit longer if you're doing an internet or mailer one, since they can do it on their own time, but 20 minutes max. Next up, we have analysis, which is a really fun part, but also a very tedious part. And at least for me, it always takes more time than I think it will. And one of the things that takes the most time, which Heidi talked about earlier, was open-ended responses. And so at the bottom there, we have a word cloud, which is really fun. We asked people if there was any trailheads that they don't go to anymore. And if there was, we asked them why. And this is a word cloud of all those responses. So taking a quick look, it might be intuitive, like, well, it's crowded, parking's an issue, and literally many dogs. But when we went through and actually coded all of these, we learned that half of the responses about dogs were actually about dog restrictions. So people were upset because their dog isn't allowed there, or the dog has to be on a leash. And so we wouldn't have understood that nuance unless we went through and actually coded everything carefully. The next tip here is to track the number of responses for each question. And so it looks like it says series 1, 2, 3 there. So in this question, we asked people if they interacted with other user groups, like other hikers, horseback riders. And so the one there is supposed to be other hikers, and then 2 is horseback riders. And then the green is they had a pleasant interaction, gray is neutral, and red is some sort of conflict. And so looking at the chart there, it looks like, well, green and gray overall, so that's pretty good, but maybe we should be worried about those horseback riders. It looks like there's definitely more conflict there. All right, but then if we look at the actual number of people who responded, people just didn't encounter horseback riders very often. And then the conflict was about 7 people out of over 2,000 people who responded to the survey. So looking at the actual numbers of people who responded, you might decide that it's not as big of an issue as the other graph makes it look like. All right. And then one of the main things you need to be careful of surveys is reducing bias. There's going to be bias. There's no avoiding it, but you can reduce it as much as possible. So one of the main things to consider is coverage, which is both geographic and temporal, and making sure that everyone that you want to participate has the opportunity to. So don't just go to the most popular trailhead to try to get as many surveys as possible. You'll want to make sure that you're going to all the ones with lower use to make sure you're getting the perspectives of those, because there's chances that they have different opinions than the ones that go to the most popular trailhead. So just be aware of who you're excluding. And once everyone has an opportunity to participate, you want to be concerned about non-response bias. So just because everyone has the opportunity doesn't mean that everyone chooses to participate, and you'll want to be careful that there's no significant differences between people who choose to participate and those who choose to not. So one way to track that, if you're doing an on-site survey, with a recent one we did, we were interested in how different activity groups responded to different things. So everyone who chose not to respond, we marked what activity they were doing. And then we could go back and see if bikers were less likely to respond. Another way to capture that if you're doing a different type of survey is to match your demographics section to the census. Especially if you're doing a resident survey, then you can compare who responded to the census to see if any kind of major groups were excluded from that. Next up we have, or wait, go back please. Okay, next point is if the self-reported information was actually accurate. So people responded, but that doesn't mean it's actually accurate. And so one aspect of this is unintentional misrepresentation. This could just be a mistake from poor question design, or people just have really bad memories. So one strategy to try to overcome that is to have time bounds around everything. So don't ask people to remember, you know, something that was from a long time ago. For our on-site surveys, we ask about their experience today, like on the trip that they just took, because that's something they could easily remember. If we asked a broader question, like how was your experience in general, they might also, they'll remember something really good or really bad that happened. So that'll stick out in their head, and then it's not really gonna be an accurate situation of what actually happens on the trail day to day. And then there could be intentional misrepresentation and social desirability. People want to look good and they will answer based on what they think you want to hear. So for example, if you ask them how often they pick up after their dog, they're gonna tell you 100%, and it might not be true. At least if you look at our trails, there's quite a few dog bags on the side. So that's, if you want to ask something about that, surveys might not be the way to go. You might want to do observations, which we'll talk about a bit later. All right, and then to wrap up each section, we're going to talk a little bit about lessons learned. So a few for surveys is data management. Especially if you're using a paper survey, you'll want to think about how your data sheet is organized and make sure the data entry is as clean and smooth as possible. So this could mean using an Access database, like you can see a little screenshot of here. We use this for a pretty long survey that we did on site, and it was pretty organized. We had different versions of the surveys, so that would reorder things for us. It would jump to different sections, so that just reduced data entry errors by a lot, and it kept it organized in the back end, so we didn't have to do a whole lot of cleaning for analysis. And that leads us to quality control. So one aspect of that is catching any of those data entry errors, but also checking if people are filling it out incorrectly. So this could be misinterpretations of different questions. Have a plan for how you're going to handle those, or if the instructions say to select one option and they select 3, have a plan for how you're consistently going to handle that. Next is to use incentives carefully. So this is related to bias. So this could involve offering a credit card for filling out a survey or having dog treats and water. You might encourage different user groups to stop and fill out the survey. So it's fine to do, it's okay to offer incentives, just be aware that you could be encouraging some groups to respond over others, and be extra careful of the non-response bias. And finally, don't make assumptions. We talked a little bit about this before, but just because your survey results say 90% of people felt crowded on the trail doesn't mean that they actually want you to do something about it. And they might actually be upset if you tried to do something to mitigate it. So to understand what management actions would be acceptable, you have to ask. Don't assume. Okay, and then gonna have some time for questions, and then we'll take a quick break. I see some questions in here.
Yeah, Anna, I noted a couple of them, if you'd like me to just share them with you right now.
Great. Yeah.
One of them, Nell asked where, and I guess when, is it okay to avoid the no opinion, don't know question? And I guess a question would be, do you mean, now when you say to avoid, do you mean not include that in the survey? And are you talking about a 3 on a 5-point scale?
Yeah, and feel free, anyone else, to jump in. I would only use no opinion, don't know. I'm trying to think of an example, but it would have to be a case where you would kind of expect everyone to have an opinion, or if you wanted to force them to kind of pick a side. And so maybe it's like with dog waste, you know, like how upset does it make you feel? And yeah, I think it's kind of rare that you wouldn't want to choose no opinion, because some people, you know, legitimately might not have an opinion. But then we've worked with people who kind of insisted on using that because they just wanted people to kind of force an opinion on each side. So that would be like a 4-point scale where very much disagree, agree, or very much agree. Does anyone else have
had a response?
Yeah.
I can't find the raise hand button. My actual hand. Yeah, as Anna just mentioned, so sometimes we ask questions where it truly isn't applicable to someone. Like on our last master plan survey, we asked people about level of parking, congestion, and crowding at certain trailheads, for example. And if someone has never been there, then legitimately they would say, you know, that doesn't apply to me, or no opinion, or whatever the choice was on that. Versus if we were going to go about asking about management strategies, for example, that would apply to, you know, everyone anywhere, then we would want to force everyone to respond because it would apply to them regardless of where they went. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so I've been also pasting a few questions here, and there's a few more coming in. One was references about where demographics should be placed in a survey. I guess I can go ahead and answer those too. We generally tend to place them at the end for a couple of reasons. One is we don't want to put anybody off by necessarily asking those questions up front. If they have any avoidance to answering demographic type questions, we still want to collect their responses on the other measures. The other reason is that demographic questions, because they're attributes of the individual, they tend to be less cognitively intensive for people to answer to, right? You don't have to think hard about where you live or how old you are. Sometimes you have to think about things like income, but generally they're also easier questions for people to answer at the end. And if they've answered a bunch of the questions up front, maybe they have sort of bought into the survey to a certain extent and are more willing to provide those. So those are some of the reasons that we go to it. Here's one. Any advice or go-to literature on how to prevent introduction of bias when coding? And maybe related to that one is somebody asked if we've have any experience with NVivo, which so.
Yeah, I can touch on that a little bit. There is literature out there. I don't know of any off the top of my head, but there's inductive and deductive coding. And so you'll just want to make sure that you know how if you're talking about coding open-ended responses, I'm assuming. And so there is literature about there. You know, one method is to kind of look through all of the responses first and kind of break it out into categories that way, or just kind of go in more blindly and then come up with categories as you go. And then to reduce bias is to have someone else do the same thing and have a code book with how you coded each response, and then have someone else do either the whole thing or a subset, and then see how much agreement or disagreement there is there. And I've used NVivo a little bit, but not enough to provide any good suggestions. If anyone else has. Yes, open-ended responses. But yeah, if you just do like a Google Scholar search and look up kind of inductive or deductive strategies for open-ended responses, that should bring up some some options.
So here's another question we'll throw out. Dion, this might be a good one for you. The question is, can you provide an example of how you go about asking whether people would like a specific management action, and do you proceed it by a related question about the status of the situation or not?
What was the second half of that?
How do you go about asking whether or not people would like a specific management action, and do you proceed it by information about the current status of the situation?
Okay, so well, the overall answer regarding the status is it depends. On a cyclical survey, we tend to not provide a lot of that context because we'll ask about management strategies over time, probably more than once, and hopefully our demographic or our population of interest is familiar with what's going on. A lot of our public here, as I had mentioned in the beginning, they're pretty aware of what's going on with open space. It's all around them. They see it every time they go out their door. They're involved in our public process and whatnot. So of course there are people that are unaware that if you do a one-off or a topical survey where maybe it's a new thing that you're going to be trying, you could have maybe a lead-in explanation or a cover sheet kind of going into the survey that you might have with your mailer or even on site. Kind of this is what we're doing and why, and provide context that way. Regarding liking a strategy, we tend to use acceptability scales related to management strategy X, Y, or Z, like how acceptable would it be to you if we started, charging $3 a day for parking or mandating dogs be on leash or something like that. But yeah, that's the general response.
Yeah, anybody else feel free to jump in here.
Sorry, Quant, one other thought. I think Anna or Heidi, I can't recall, I'm sorry, who mentioned something about don't make assumptions. So you might want to follow up an acceptability question with whether or not they want something to be done about it. So even if somebody finds the level of crowding or the level of dogs off leash or the level of whatever is perceived to be a problem to you as the manager, the visitors may or may not want you to do something about it. So you have to establish first that the general public wants something to be done about it. Then you would go for the level of acceptability related to your potential intervention.
Here's one that I know both Heidi and Anna have experience with. What do you do with incomplete surveys? Do you throw them out or include the questions that were answered?
Yeah, lots of experience with that. It partly depends. We ended up coming up with a threshold. So if the survey, I forget which threshold we used, but if it wasn't more than 75% complete, then we threw it out. And then we did it more from a question by question case. Yeah, and so if they just didn't answer a question, or if there was a different level that they got it wrong, so if we could interpret their intention, we would fix it. But if we couldn't, or they just completely misinterpreted what we asked them to do, then we would just throw out that question, but we would keep the rest of the survey responses. But we had a really long page document of how to treat different questions in special cases like that. So one of the most important things is to just be consistent, especially if you have multiple people working on it.
Let's see, here's one quick one I can answer. What stacks packages have you found useful? We do use SPSS pretty extensively for survey analysis. We also use R pretty extensively for myriad of data sets. If we've had control over the data entry process and we can ensure that the structure is pretty clean, it's usually fairly easy to move directly to SPSS. if we are dealing with a platform where we've had less control over the data entry, maybe, for example, it's gone into an online platform that's a little, doesn't necessarily put everything in a clean analysis format. R can certainly run lots of the stats that you need. There's been some other questions on pre-post analyses. So whether it depends on the type of question you're doing, and of course with the type of test you're gonna run. A lot of our stuff ends up being categorical data. So we're often looking at chi-squared analyses. SPSS can do that. R can do that. R is particularly helpful if you need to be doing a little bit of data manipulation and cleanup. It's got a lot of nice functions in there, and it's easy. Any code-based thing is easy if you need to sort of reiterate periodically over time to refine your analysis, but certainly a lot of the survey work we were doing, if we wanted to see if residency had changed over time, for example, those we're often looking at chi-squared and then looking at the appropriate corrections to account for the number of comparisons we were making, and then also determining where those differences had actually occurred.
Yes. Thank you, Rena, for catching some of these as well in the chat.
Yeah, so let's see. Looking at other ones here.
While Colin is looking, I just wanted to point out, for whatever we don't get covered today, we can archive the chat and we'll provide our contact information at the end of this presentation. I welcome anyone to send us questions or follow up after today's session is over.
Here's one again that you might be able to talk about, Dion, on exploratory look into open-ended coded data. What statistical tests do you use first and why?
I'm sorry, for coding open-ended responses?
Yeah. The question is, what statistical tests do you use first and why? But I was also thinking about some of the other qualitative work that we've done.
For coding, we don't really start with a statistical test. We start with a keyword search and start to theme out everything by a keyword, and then those keywords into themes, and then probably the themes into categories. The statistical test would come in when you have, as Anna mentioned, your second person go over and code the same responses. Then you're looking for similarity across the two people. So you could run like a kappa to understand the inter-rater kind of coding reliability across the coded responses from the raw response to the theme to the end category.
There's another question here. How are some of the ways that you've dealt with non-response bias, particularly if you have little or no information about the people who are not responding?
Yeah, that's a hard one. So you want to try to make sure you know as much as you can about the people who are allowed to take the survey. And that's why we avoid online surveys as much as we can, especially if it's a link that can be shared with people, because we just don't have control over who sees it. And then, you know, you also don't have control of like people taking the same survey over and over and over. And so there's some ways you can help prevent that. You know, you can see if the same IP address responded multiple times. Or, you know, you could send it out to a listserv or something and ask people to keep it to people in that listserv so you know who responded. And then As I mentioned before, if you do have access to people who received it but chose not to take it, you can do a little extra effort to ask them to just respond to 1 or 2 key questions that are important. So you can help to use that. That makes sense.
We also, for our resident survey, which is our mailback, the visitor survey is the on-site to understand people that are currently coming to open space, the attributes about them, and we record the activity type of those that didn't respond. And then, as Anna mentioned, we look at particular questions, if it's surrounding something more contentious like level of conflict, to see if by activity, for example, the responses are all over the board, then we would know that it's probably more a problem if we have a high non-response from a certain activity type. With the mailer that I mentioned, we look at who responded, and then we take the step to weight that back to known county demographics. So I think we discussed, we model ours off of the census data, so we know who's out there currently in the county, and then we know who responded, and we choose to weight those that do respond to the known county census proportion, so that hopefully we have a pretty good representation of our population at the county level.
Yeah, I think that maybe relates to another question that has come up a couple of times here, and maybe we can end on this question and then move on to our next section. Is sort of scenarios for longitudinal survey design versus cross-sectional survey design. I guess we could use our on-site visitor survey as an example. It's sort of a hybrid of both. It's a 2-sided document, and we've got a big matrix that we use that Dion created to understand which questions we can trend across time. Those tend to be sort of the attribute type questions, activities that people do, how long they've been visited, or the length of their outings, how frequently they visit. I don't know if I already mentioned all the demographic questions. Those ones, so we do that study on about a 5-year cycle. So in some ways, those questions can serve as cross-sectional for that point in time. We can also understand if the distribution of activities is changing over time, or if people are able to visit more frequently, or they're coming from different locations. We also have a fair number of sort of cross-sectional things. So on our most recent one, we looked at topics related to parking difficulty and mode of arrival. Some more specifics about infrastructure design and importance and quality. So we tend to sort of do a hybrid of those, where we have one part of our survey, which every time that the survey cycle comes up, we have that sort of block of real estate where we can deal with those sort of emergent management questions. We don't really intend to ask them again in 10 years down the road. We may opportunistically, but it's not part of that longitudinal design. But when we do go, we've tried to standardize many of those questions, some of those questions over time, so that we really can do that longitudinal analysis. All right. Well, a lot of great questions. So remind me, I think, yep, we scheduled a 10-minute break so everybody can officially get up. I'll go ahead and post that up. So why don't we'll restart in 10 minutes, which is 11:35 Mountain Time, adjusted for whatever time zone you're in. All right.
could include compliance with regulations, such as abiding to dog leash requirements or on-trail use, infrastructure interactions like waste sorting or kiosk greeting, or even illegal parking. Interactions or behaviors that come and go, which are categorized under transient phenomena. So this could include social interactions, human or pet and wildlife interaction, interfacing with a treatment, like a temporarily placed trail sign or a barricade, and yielding by different recreation groups. Also for behaviors, interactions, or experiences that are difficult to remember or estimate. We mentioned this a little bit earlier, but visitors are often unreliable in reporting self-reported compliance of regulations or the behaviors of others, the frequency of a behavior of themselves or others, and the number of encounters or group sizes they've seen. And finally, if you have limited capacity or funds and are unable to design and implement maybe a visitor survey or purchase automated equipment, which we'll talk about in the third section, and if you're just seeking a snapshot of what is happening, direct observations can be a really good choice. So if we go to the next slide, there are 4 main types of observation. The first 2 involve a human completing the observations. So we have unobtrusive observations, and that includes a human observer deliberately collecting observations of participants in a natural, unaltered setting. The observer is close enough to the party being observed so they can observe what's actually taking place in their sight of vision, or possibly by using binoculars. And ideally, the observer is posted out of sight as much as possible, so observation behaviors aren't altered. Second are interactive observations. These also use humans as the data collectors, but the individual who's collecting the data is in closer proximity to the party being observed. So whether that involves the observer being alongside or interacting with the party, or the data collector could be roving through a predetermined zone and acting as a stooge, which has them actually involved in the interactions. And then the last 2 observation types are, they use different types of technology to capture the observations. So we have camera traps, which take still photos and capture a moment in time. And then we also have videos, which provide continuous live footage. So both of these technologies allow for observations to occur without human presence, and this can be really helpful if observations are needed around the clock, or if it's at odd hours or far remote locations, or possibly if personnel are not available and you're requiring a higher resolution of data. All right, so if we go to the next slide, you also want to consider how and where the behaviors or interactions you're observing have the potential to occur. So this will help you determine where you actually want to collect your data. So it's important to recognize if it's best captured by observing a visitor party through a zone or a line transect. So zonal observations involve observing a visitor party from when they first enter the zone to when they exit the zone. So the observer actually watches all of the behaviors throughout the whole entire zone. So we have a photo or an image of that on the top left here. So it'd be when they first enter into the zone throughout the whole time, that purplish color. So an advantage is, if you're doing zonal observations, is that you get to observe a party for a longer period of time. So it provides more opportunity for contextual interactions. Like, does a visitor party always social distance when passing another party? And you have numerous opportunities to observe this throughout the zone. Whereas a disadvantage is that they encompass a larger observation area, therefore your sample size will be lower since you're observing each of these parties for an extended period of time. Whereas for line transects, which you can see up as that gray line crossing through the trail, is when you're observing when a visitor party crosses this imaginary line. So there's a higher sample size per session, but it's also used for times when you're not trying to capture something contextually, like leash regulations, or does a person have a face covering on when they're starting at the trail? You wouldn't be able to see that. Whereas if you were observing variables right when they cross the line, it provides insights for just that short snippet of time right when they're passing through there. So on top of zones and line transects, you also want to consider if you're observing trail or trailhead behavior. So you can't describe trail behaviors by observing people at the trailhead and vice versa. So you want to be aware of where you're actually planning on observing each behavior. Also, you want to consider, do you need to give time or distance for a visitor to begin expressing the behavior you're observing? And also another consideration is, will these behaviors taper off after a certain distance or time? So we have a few photos here. So as you can see on the top right, this was from one of our recent studies where we were observing face coverings, and we did a line transect. And so we were observing visitors when they were coming from the parking lot on the top of that photo, heading south onto the trail, and we observed if they had their face covering on right when they passed through that line transect, that yellow dotted line. And the bottom left is a picture of zonal observations. So we were watching the visitors when they were coming from the parking lot, which is on the right side of that photo, and we watched them right when they came into our line of sight throughout the whole zone until they left our line of sight past those 3 trees. So that would be an example of zonal. And then on the bottom right, we were observing another line transect right past that signage. So again, an imaginary line going right through the trail. And I just want to also point out on the top right, as it might be a little bit hard to see, but there's that yellow line transect with the arrow, which was directing us where the visitors were coming in, but that little blue square to the left of that, that's where the observer sat. So it was off trail, so hopefully not impacting the visitor behaviors. All right, so if we can go to the next slide, we're going to share some topics of interest where observational methods have helped us collect the data we desire. So these topics include visitation levels, visitor activities, modes of transportation, visitor behaviors, behavior impacts, and regulation compliance. So we'll jump right into visitation levels. If you're wanting, so the next slide, please. If you're wanting to measure visitation levels through observation, you may use the method of observing people at one time, which is known as PAOT, or people per view, which is PPV. So people at one time is the number of people in a defined area at a point in time. This is often used at destinations or gathering areas like mountain peaks or viewpoints. And PAOTs can predict how often an area is particularly dense. PPV is similar in that it also captures a point in time, but it looks at the linear density along a defined trail segment. So the data can be collected from either a viewpoint of the visitor, or the observer again can be off trail looking at the trail from a perpendicular viewpoint. This method can be used in highly populated, high use areas or low use areas like in the backcountry or wilderness. One other method is number of encounters. This provides data points over time instead of a snapshot. So the data collector is counting how many people or groups are encountered during a certain distance, like a mile, or during an hour of hiking, so a duration of time. I also want to point out here, it's important to note the difference between objective phenomena versus subjective or evaluative response. So people at one time will give you a number, which is objective, versus the subjective or evaluative concept of crowding, which is a subjective measure, which is based on evaluation of the situation. So those are not interchangeable. And it's really important to notice the objective versus the subjective component. All right, if we could go to the next slide. So observations can also give data on visitor activities and when select activities may be popular on certain trails. So you can observe what recreation activity an individual is participating in, plus record if visitor activities change at select locations temporally. So maybe the runners come out early in the morning and then the rock climbers come out, or are the cyclists the first ones to hit the trails? So this direct observation can really help with that. Another added bonus to observational data collection is that observers can collect numerous data points and not just the one variable. So observers could also record how many visitors are in each visitor party or additional behaviors they're interested in collecting. However, like we mentioned in the survey section, you really want to be mindful of what data you're collecting and how it's going to be used. Don't collect data just to collect or hoard data. Some limitations are you can't always tell through observation what a visitor's primary activity is. So they may appear to be a hiker, but they have a backpack, and in their backpack, they might have some climbing gear. So their actually main activity is climbing. So there are some limitations to this method as well. Modes of transportation. So modes of arrival to the trailhead can also be recorded through direct observation. Some visitors may arrive by car, bike, public transportation, horses. We've seen horseback riders ride at the trail. The type of observation your visitors arrive into the trail can be really informative and shed light on different components of the visitor experience. For us right now, parking is a hot topic for us, and we've been collecting a bunch of different data on that, which has been extremely valuable. It's also important to note that in order to capture this information, you need to strategically be located for the actual data you're looking to collect. So if you're looking to figure out how your visitors are arriving to the trail, obviously you would need to be closer to the trailhead or in an area where you can actually observe the parking lot. Whereas if you're looking for different types of behaviors that might occur further up the trail, you would want to be posted up further, higher up the trail. All right, so with that being said, I'm going to pass it on to Dion to get into visitor behaviors and impacts.
All right, so there are certain types of things where direct observation is going to be a good method for you versus a survey that we just went over previously. Sometimes the self-reported behavior isn't as accurate as you would hope it would be, or people have a hard time remembering or estimating whatever it is that you're interested in. So for visitor behaviors and impacts, you may be interested in on-trail or off-trail use, or things such as the upper left picture there of someone interacting with a kiosk. You might want to know how many or what proportion of your visitors coming into your area stop and notice the kiosk, or how long they spend reading whatever you have displayed there, to see you can get at the underlying construct of effectiveness for signs, for example. Other things that you can look at regarding visitor behavior in a more passive sense, you can look for things such as trail conditions. You can see there on the lower right, we have some trail widening, some trail braiding. You may want to directly observe the amount of trash or graffiti if that's a problem in your area. Other things that we look at, and you could look at if you don't have the opportunity to have a formal trail condition program, are the development of undesignated trails, such as there on the lower left. That picture there on the lower left is a good example where we had a paired methodology. We put up these barriers and the education sign, as you can see there. That's an undesignated trail we were trying to get people to no longer use. We paired the direct observation with a survey where they were intercepted later on their trip. So we knew exactly who did and didn't take this undesignated trail. And we were able to compare the self-reported data did underreport the proportion that we're using the undesignated trail. So we learned it was a proof of concept, as we'd never done this before, but we proved that direct observation would be a better way to go for that type of data collection. Next slide, please. Another big one that we do here that you may be interested in as well is looking at what proportion of your visitors comply with regulations that you have posted, or certain regulations where you've been tasked with understanding the compliance level. Big one here might be for you is dog regulation. So we look at all types of things regarding dogs, whether they're on leash or they're under control, or they're displaying a voice and sight tag, or they're chasing wildlife, all kinds of things that we look at where visitors tend to not report very accurately if you ask them directly on a survey. So we go through the process of designing very specific parameters for observation so we can accurately and precisely measure compliance with, Regulation X regarding dogs. We also have areas where we have trail closures. These are typically temporary things that we have, not a systematic closure where maybe an automated counting system, which we'll go over next, would be more prudent or more time effective, but maybe you don't have the time or the funds to put up a short-term counter. You can go out and directly observe how many people are trespassing through an area or entering a closure when you don't want them to be. Another thing that we have done recently regarding COVID-19, we put down on the ground, and that's a weird way of saying that. We designed and implemented on the ground 2 studies related to COVID-19 compliance, one regarding social distance behavior, and then another one regarding compliance with our public health mandate to wear a face cover while out recreating. You can see the sign there on the lower right is a picture of a sign that we have out telling people what the regulation is regarding COVID and keeping your distance and face coverings. As Heidi showed in the previous slide, we're doing it a couple of different ways. So social compliance being contextual, we have a zone where we watch a party walk through and we record systematically all the interactions they have with other people. And then regarding face covers, we're also recording that as they come in within 6 feet of another visitor. And then we have a separate inquiry going on, which is just kind of get a snapshot or the intention to comply. We're running a separate study to look at face cover presence across a line intercept, which is generally speaking closer to the trailhead. So we can get a complete picture of someone incoming, their intent to comply, and then as they kind of scoot along the trail, are they actually complying when they interact with others? That graph there on the lower left is just a recent example from our most recent reporting period. Wanted to point out, so we have 3 locations displayed here, and one overarching guiding principle that we'll talk about today is regarding percentages. I think Anna mentioned you have to be aware that sometimes the N values or the sample size associated with an individual area or an individual behavior might be pretty low, where the percentage may not be the best way to represent that information or could be misunderstood as applying to a greater number of visitors. But wanted to point out, for whatever reason, it was slow at Sanitas Valley, that one there on the right, during this reporting period, and we actually only had 4 observations to support that percentage. So if someone saw that, they would think, oh, Sanitas is wonderful, 75% of the people are complying, but underneath that, we only had 4 observations, so we wouldn't have any sort of confidence surrounding that percentage. So you just want to be careful when you're reporting out sample sizes and percentages. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to run through some underlying principles related to direct observation. One being that you can't directly observe a lot of things that you might be interested in. The things on this particular slide here in quotes are the things that we would call a construct, or the thing that you're interested in understanding. The examples I have listed here, you might be interested in, are dogs harassing people? Maybe you have a regulation against that in your area, or you want to understand crowding, or if people understood the message. That picture there on the left is a blow up of that undesignated trail barrier I had on the previous one. But this was something that we threw out there on the system, and then we observed people whether or not they understood the message through the behavior that we had established of stopped and read the sign for at least 5 seconds. As Heidi mentioned, you may want to understand the concept of crowding, but you can't go out and directly observe crowding. You have to establish whatever that means for your area and then go out and record or directly observe the persons at one time. And with dogs, you may understand that harassing people is something that you don't want in your system, but you can't go out and directly observe whether or not a dog is harassing someone, but you could go out and observe whether or not a dog is jumping on someone or repeatedly barking at them or charging at them or circling them or otherwise displaying a behavior that you've predetermined is something that exemplifies that construct that you're getting at, which is harassing. Another one that we commonly do here is regarding the yielding triangle and whether or not cyclists are yielding to other visitors. And part of our code of regulations that we have here is establishing communication. The way that we go about determining whether or not someone has established communication is through an auditory cue while someone is out directly observing, either ringing a bell or verbally announcing themselves as they pass. So the overarching kind of principle here is you have your construct or the thing that you want to be able to report out on or that may be contained in your regulatory code, but you have to turn that into something that you could reliably and repeatably observe on the ground as a behavior that your field technicians would record while out in their zone or line transect. Okay, next slide, please. So something that is really, really important and critical to set up front is your code book, which is going to be more or less your glossary of terms or your kind of encyclopedia for what you're up to for your study. So it's a written documentation of the behaviors, of the definitions. It's helpful to have examples of what people might actually see on the system. And then you can see there in the lower left, we've done this for, as I mentioned, dog studies for years and years and years, since 2006. We do have related, BRC stands for Boulder Revised Code. And so we're always trying to estimate compliance with things that are in our actual code of regulations that apply to open space. And the way that we do that is take the Boulder Revised Code and kind of unpack that into a particular behavior that someone's sitting out in one of those stations, stationary observation, looking at the zone or the transect could directly observe, you know, behavior X, Y, or Z as relates to that code. Then one thing to consider is you're definitely gonna want to observe things that are considered an aggregate of behaviors. Harassing in itself is an aggregate, aggression is an aggregate. So you're gonna have to come up with definitions that kind of are combinations of discrete behaviors that you're gonna see. It's gonna happen so quickly, and you may even try, we certainly have in the past, attempted to observe discrete behaviors related to aggression and harassment. It happens so quickly that your field recorder simply cannot record the sequence of events if it happens in, you know, a second or 2 seconds and there's 3 or 4 markers of harassment or aggression. And so to get around that, you pre-develop and agree upon with your staff, with your management, potentially with your public, the published literature, this suite of behaviors indicates this thing or the underlying construct such as aggression or harassment, and then you developed a code book down to the individual behavior that your field technician will record while they're sitting there. Down there in the lower right, I wanted to point out that it's best practice to have your field technicians always recording the frequency of your discrete or aggregate behavior in real numbers. So they're simply recording the number of times that they observed a predetermined behavior while in your zone or across your transect. The example there, they either are or are not wearing a face cover, or they have one visible but it's not worn. So the field recorder is not, while they're sitting there, determining compliance or one of those underlying constructs, they're recording the frequency of a behavior that you've developed and agreed upon and have fully fleshed out in your code book. Okay, next slide, please. All right, here we go, training and testing. So because people and pets are fairly unpredictable or can be unpredictable, you're gonna wanna do a significant amount of training and testing. You're gonna start with the code book. As I mentioned, we do a pretty hefty amount of office work. So your team there, the team there on the upper left, they're in the field now testing something that has already been developed and understood, reviewed. You may even want to, in the office, if you're doing observation of, you know, dogs or yielding or whatever it is, you can find videos associated with that thing that you're going to attempt to measure in real time as visitors are moving through your zone. So you can sit there while you're in a controlled atmosphere with your definitions in front of you, try out your data sheet, talk about what you're seeing, go through it. Then you're going to go out on the system, and when we go out in a real block of time, typically 2 to 3 hours, and people they're in proximity to each other in that photo because they're in an established area for observation. However, they're not speaking to each other while they're out there. They're recording everything as it runs through, and then at the end of the test session, you can look at what was recorded across all those 3 people and figure out whether or not they're doing so reliably across each other for the whatever it is that you're looking at. And we do that to make the data collection more defensible in the end. If you're in the business of watching people or pets, you probably have a community that's going to be vocal about such things. Having done the work to pre-test and kind of determine how close you are in recording across people will do a lot for your credibility and kind of acceptance of the results down the line. One way that you can do that, the kappa statistic there on the lower left is a pretty common example of how you can run a statistic on inter-rater reliability. And we go with the 0.61 and above, so substantial agreement. I think it's accepted in the literature to start at that 0.41 or at least moderate agreement. Because Boulder, Colorado, we know is a very educated and very scientifically driven community. We do receive a lot of scrutiny, and so we've chosen to go with the 0.61 and above. So whatever the factor is, we would modify and keep modifying and testing until we get to at least that 0.61 agreement across all the observers. Next slide, please. So the last thing that I'll mention regarding kind of your pre-work or your study documentation, we create site maps for all of our locations for each study. This particular map here might be hard to see, but up there on the lower left, you can see all of our sites have a unique identifier. So this is site 792. So over time, we can refer to this site. We know that it's coal seam trail. We know that it spans from point A to point B. So this would be an example of a zonal based observation. We also can document there on the lower right things that anybody going to this area would want to know, such as the general location or where the access point is, how long it takes to get there, the length of the zone. You can see the small there on the lower left. There's a scale there. We also have blow up versions of this that the field observers could view online. Everyone is studying these prior to going out. And so everyone knows this is the zone, this is where it starts, this is where it ends. And so it definitely helps with repeatability across people and time, whether it's within one study period and you have, let's say you have 3 to 5 observers, you want to know that all 3 to 5 people are measuring the same thing, the same start point, the same end point, or the same line transect if you're going that route. And then across time, I know myself, I would never remember where A was or where B was, 5 years from now, but I can pull up this map and I have a digital recording of where that was so we can defensively repeat it over time. Next slide, please. I'm very briefly going to talk about data management analysis. We've talked about code books and the need to come up with defined parameters surrounding each variable that you're interested in. We definitely try. You can see the little gal up there on the upper left. She's the data wrangler. So we try to be intentional, organized, and make sure everything is codified for sure before it's going on the ground, but hopefully well before, so that you can have a chance to discuss your definitions with your coworkers or your public, or maybe you have a board of decision makers. You can also look at them against any published definitions or kind of established literature regarding whatever it is that you're looking at. Make sure that what you're up to is the best practice for that topic for this time period. You want to consider the data cycle in every phase of your study. So from the get-go, you're thinking about analysis even when you're designing the indicators or the variables or the codes you're going to assign to them. Having the least amount of data transformation in the end is going to be your best bet. And data wrangling can be challenging. There's going to be things that you're going to want to collect that are going to require cleanup in the end or transformation. Taking it, as I mentioned, especially if you're looking at those latent constructs like harassment or crowding, you have to take your raw data and somehow transform that to a reportable metric that is understood to the common public. People aren't going to necessarily care about the individual behaviors, but they are going to care about what you're doing regarding probably a problem if you're doing direct observation. So having kind of organized and codified ways of doing that, it's going to up your credibility and transparency with the public that you serve, and just a higher level of trust. Kind of, I think Heidi mentioned relationship building. So you're not really hiding anything. You're trying to be as upfront as possible. This is what we're doing. This is why. Here's how it's defined, and here's how we transformed it from raw data to whatever it is, the statistic that you're reporting to your public. And then there on the lower left, I just wanted to provide one example. As I mentioned, we have done a lot of dog monitoring. We've done one particular study very cyclically since 2006, which is compliance with our voice and sight regulations. I wanted to point out there if you can see at all the labels on the individual bars. So those are individual things that we looked at for each observation. You can see the percentages associated with each particular thing regarding maintaining a voice and sight controlled dog on our system. Then the last thing I wanted to say, over there on the right, you'll see insufficient data. So this goes back to being really careful about reporting percentages, where during this study period, we only observed 4 discrete times, 4 events where a dog was chasing wildlife. And if we chose not to display that sample size, which is 4, it may look like 75% of the time, dogs are out of compliance with chasing wildlife. What the reader wouldn't know is that we only observed that 4 times out of probably hundreds of observations. So you have to be really careful about what you're reporting and how you choose to report it, just so that it's clear. Maybe it's a subset, maybe it's the whole, but you yourself are very clear about which part you're reporting on, whether it be the whole sample, or for this one, it would be those that had the opportunity to interact with wildlife. And with that, I think we're to the end of direct observation. We observed whether or not this dog was reading the sign.
All right. So let me. Yeah, so we can open up for questions. Not too many have been posted in the chat yet, but I think people should be able to unmute themselves. So I guess at this time, if anybody has a question and wants to ask it, you could maybe unmute and say your name and ask a question. In the meantime, we do have one that was just in the chat here from Aaron about briefly describing the ethics or other considerations with direct observation.
Do you mean, is it ethically correct to directly observe, or how we go about defending that? I guess I'll just say what we have here in our code, particular language regarding no expectation of privacy. I think everybody on this call is probably aware that wherever you go in the world, the gas station, Target, the grocery store, the street, the stoplight, everywhere you go, you're being recorded. So I don't think there's any expectation of privacy. Same thing applied to open space. When people come to open space and they're on public property, we legally have the right to observe whatever we want, whenever we want. However, we tend to preface anything that we're up to, especially if it's going to be contentious, like dog management or potential visitor access restrictions or something. Our project, the direct observation would most likely be tied to a larger community engagement process or a public process that's already in place. So the public is aware kind of that it's happening. In the beginning, we wouldn't share the particular location, so we wouldn't compromise the integrity of the data collection. We never ever try to hide what we're up to. If somebody asked us what we were up to, we would be very honest and let them know that we're conducting visitor monitoring in the area that day. The one thing that can get a little tricky, not so much with direct observation, but with surveys, is interacting with persons less than 18 years of age, where you would have to get some sort of consent. But if you have unobtrusive observation, there's no need to get that consent. It's perfectly okay and ethically correct to observe in any public area here in Boulder, Colorado.
Yeah, I'd also add that most of our direct observation applies to large, not necessarily our entire population, but large subsets of our population. You know, I could see some of those questions coming up if we were ever asked to target a very specific subset of the population. In this case, was it about 30% of our visitors have dogs with them on any given day? So, you know, when we're talking about thousands of visits a day, that's a pretty diverse group. I can't think of a specific example off the top of my head for subpopulation that might be so small that it might start bringing up ethical concerns, but I'm sure it's out there. Where, and I'm thinking in the type of scenario where if we released information about or results about those behaviors, that other people could then pretty easily identify individuals within that population, or a small number of individuals. But we just haven't had that type of scenario come up.
Yeah, and lastly, we've never attempted to study, and I don't think we ever would, through direct observation, anything that would be considered private. Like, we wouldn't, you know, sit behind an outhouse and see, you know, what happens behind there or something, or what goes on in that nook of the woods where things may happen. It's almost always in an open environment, either near the trailhead or within the first quarter mile. Yeah, so it's never anything. Hopefully people are behaving as they normally would in public, and it's nothing that somebody would be attempting, you know, to hide or would be considered personal.
So there's another question here from Steve about being subject to any sort of institutional review board. By and large, as a municipal level organization, we are not. When we do need to, most of our studies, whether they're particularly the surveys, one of our criteria is that everybody has to be 18 or older. Then we generally don't have to enter into the realm of consent for minors. However, we do a fair amount of sort of contracted or cooperative work with universities. And oftentimes if we're working with universities, which tends to be, I'd say, some of our more exploratory research as well. And they've helped with both survey work and observational work. Generally, when we do research through those universities, then it's subject to whatever institutional reviews the universities are subject to. So I guess that's not a perfect answer, but I'll say a lot of the stuff we do in-house is sort of simplistic enough, or at least not so controversial that it would elevate it to that level. We often prefer to have the backing of a university for those more exploratory type projects.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a pro and a con, I guess. A definite pro of being municipal level is IRB doesn't apply to us, and we don't typically receive any federal funds. So all of those federal regulations associated with human observation in the Code of Federal Regulations don't apply to us. So it's definitely a pro. A con being we can't then say in the end that it went through a review board or it went through that kind of scrutiny of a federal regulatory type thing. When it's something that we think is going to be contentious or something that may be hotly debated or in the end may be more difficult for the public to understand, we do take the step to intentionally include some of our colleagues that are in academia and do a peer review. It's not the same as an IRB, but it's something that we do both for building trust as well as verifying what we're doing is considered best practice, things like that. And when we were setting up the dog monitoring, for example, in the very beginning, way back in 2004 or 5, we hadn't done such a thing. And so we inquired with other practitioners that had done so. We also checked in with our local dog society, people here that train dogs. They do dog behavior for a living. We checked in with some of the dog behavior labs that are housed within various academic platforms across the nation, dog ethologists, all of those people provided input on the behaviors that we were observing, the definitions that we held, and kind of the ins and outs of how to monitor systematically dog behavior in public lands.
I'm going to interject really quickly and take this moment to remind any of the latecomers who came into the Zoom meeting, into this workshop, if you don't know where these questions are, if you click on the chat, if you hover at the bottom of your screen and click on the chat, you can type in any questions at any time and get your questions answered there. And if you don't know how to do that, you can click on my name, Rena Hauptfeld, the right side of my name, I think will give you, you can chat me directly and ask.
So here's another good question that just came up is the issue with people altering the behavior. I think Dion alluded to this. We really try hard to not publish the locations where we are doing observations. It'll depend a little bit study to study. Some of these COVID related observations we're doing, we may only have 3 to 6 locations. So it's possible that people may figure those out over time. It can depend a little bit on the study itself. So things like face cover presence, sort of as an indication of behavioral intention. There's probably a low probability that people will alter those behaviors, right? They've already arrived to the trailhead and left their vehicle, and whether or not they are going to carry a face cover with them is largely predetermined. Other things like dog observations, we may have upwards of 80 locations, and when we're drawing the samples for those, it's a random it's a random sample of when and where we're going to be. So even if people do know the locations, it's going to be pretty difficult for them to predict when and where we'll be out there. But generally we try and do things unobtrusive. So we have, we have staff shirts that have logos on them. Oftentimes when we're doing these observations, we just dress in what we call street clothes. We try not to be too obvious, although somebody sitting off to the side of the trail in a chair is not completely incognito. So, but that's generally how we try and deal with that. The other interesting thing we've sort of found over time is that a lot of people, and I've been in situations observing where I thought I must look pretty odd, and people don't seem to bat an eye at the fact that I'm sitting on the side of a trail with a clipboard and a data sheet jotting down notes. So I don't know if that says something about our community in particular or what, but interesting observation.
Yeah, sometimes you pretend like we're painting or reading a book or something. That can sometimes help diffuse any suspicions. But the camera trap is a good point too. We haven't used it, at least that I know of, for behavioral observations, partly just because it's so much more work to sift through all the photos, but it's definitely an option. And I think it has been used at least by partner agencies to look at like dog leash compliance before, but correct me if I'm wrong with that, Dion.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, the Human Dimensions team hasn't used that as a method. However, with our other colleagues at Open Space and Mountain Parks, we have put up camera traps looking at human incursion into wildlife closures, for example, in remote locations where placing a human observer would be not a good thing to do, or maybe would be a 2-hour hike in. Then you have to consider someone has to manually review all of the photos and be in charge of maintaining the camera. So it's just something to consider. If it's something more remote, or maybe you don't have available staff to sit out and do blocks of direct observation, you just have to make sure you have the time and energy and the funds to maintain the equipment, as well as you could have hundreds, even thousands. We had thousands of photos, for example, associated with the wildlife study that I mentioned. It's just something to consider. And it's something, cameras work best for a discrete behavior where it's a line transect or within a polygon that the detection zone of the camera could see, not anything contextual that you would want to have direct observation for.
Yeah, and it just makes me think, one thing I'll clarify in case it wasn't immediately obvious. When we're doing those zonal observations, they're generally sort of focal observations. So we're observing one visitor party or group throughout the entire time that they traverse that zone. And so everything is evaluated in relation to that group. So they may have multiple possibilities for interactions, or if we're observing dog behaviors, they might have multiple opportunities for their dog to interact with another group on them. But we stay focused on that particular group. In the past, we've attempted to do sort of scan observations. The trade-off is when you're trying to scan a large area, you tend to only be able to detect more macro behaviors. And so if you're trying to more comprehensively assess your predefined set of behaviors, you're probably better off using a focal sampling method, just so that you can pay attention and be attentive to that. The big trade-off, though, is that it takes longer to get it. If you're focused on one group for a 5-minute period, right, that 5 minutes and whatever happens during that 5 minutes, depending on how you analyze it, that may just be one sample there, and so it may take you a little bit longer to get a large sample size.
And for the question about cameras up for the shelter in place, that's very interesting. As far as I know, we have a wildlife team also, and I don't know if they have cameras out right now. We do have some up because we're doing a parking study, and so we left some up so we'll be able to look at some differences. But again, with all the time it takes to sift through photos, we don't have any good results yet. But nothing about wildlife behavior from cameras that we anecdotally know that people have seen more wildlife coming into town after the shelter in place went into effect.
Yeah, and reading that question again, I guess I'll point out that actually we had the opposite. The trails, we never closed. And in fact, we'll show some of this in the next with some of our count data, which we did have trail counters up before and now during a lot of these closures. To some degree, we remained the only activity available in town, so we saw a pretty significant jump up after. So if anything, it'd probably be a question of wildlife response to increased visitation, but we have worked with our wildlife team in the past, and there's certainly a lot of questions to answer in the future about the big question of wildlife response to human presence. But that's where probably some of this observational work needs to go, in that it's not just about levels of use, it's also about behaviors and the timing of those behaviors. So a fair bit of complexity in there. All right, well, unless there's if people want to keep posting questions in the chat, we can answer them in there. Otherwise, we'll take another few minutes for everybody to stretch their legs, and then we'll jump back into automated counters. So let's see, 12, we'll say 10 minutes, so 12:40 Mountain Time, or 20 minutes till the hour, whenever that is for you. All right. You ready to get back at it? All right. Well, I wish we'd all been able to see each other more in person, but I've been glad that we've been getting some good questions. So keep them coming as we dive into our next session on automated counters. So Anna and I will be trading back and forth a little bit on this one, going over some of the concepts for this. So automated counters. The difference between this section and our previous two is that now we're talking a bit more about equipment. So we've decided to use the term counters. Really underlying this, we're talking about different sensor technologies used to detect things. In this case, generally we'll be talking about trail counters or vehicle counters, but we'll get into some of those options later. So when are automated counters a good choice? As it says in the name, when you're trying to get counts of things, in this case, really your counters underlying that is some sort of sensor that can generally detect the presence or absence of something. If you're talking about a trail counter that's pointing across the trail, it's detecting whether or not a person walked by or didn't walk by. If the big benefits of counters is that you can do much more with time series analysis. You can do that because you're getting a census of what's going on at that particular location over the duration of time that you are doing the measurements or conducting the measurements. So when we say census in this case, we mean that if you're putting out a trail counter and you leave it out for a week or 2 weeks or a month or a year. So long as it's operating and operating correctly, you are picking up counts of every single visitor that walks by on that trail. So we'll go into some of the things you have to consider with how you may need to adjust those counts just due to some environmental factors and how the sensors operate. But the difference would be compared to something like an observational method where you may just go out for a few hours at a time on random days, collect some counts. Then you're getting a sample of what visitation looks like, but with a trail counter, you're able to get a more complete picture. Because you're generally talking about equipment, which can range in cost, but a lot of the counters we use are maybe on the order of $500 a unit. That's not pocket change, but if you're talking about being able to put out 10 of those over the course of a year, it is generally less than what it would cost to pay a whole team of field technicians to collect data, and they certainly wouldn't be able to stay out there 24/7 for a long period of time. So you can get much better spatial coverage with trail counters, either by having more of them or by rotating them around in blocks across different points on your trail system. And they also offer the opportunity, we'll get into this a little bit later, of being able to provide more frequent updates to conditions on your trail system, where it may take you a long time using observational methods to get a large enough sample to be able to describe visitation levels in an area. If you have trail counters and you sort of get the data flow refined, you can start analyzing those data pretty quickly. So as I alluded to, there's sort of two main classes plus an additional bonus class of counters that we'll be talking about here. Trail counters are the first ones. Those are probably what people are most familiar with. Trail counters have actually been around for a pretty long time. Some of the early ones were actually wildlife counters that used both a transmitter and receiver with an active infrared beam, and when something walked past it, it would break the beam and it would register a count. As other companies started making more specific pedestrian counters, those started offering new features, larger memory capacities, that sort of thing. There's a little graphic down there, the yellow with the horse and the person and the bike. That's actually, I give credit where credit is due. That's directly from a company called EcoCounter. We do use a number of their counters now, but those counters can actually do multimodal classification. So you can bury an inductive loop under the trail so that it can distinguish between bikes and pedestrians. You can even mount a second sensor up higher to detect horseback riders, so you can get equestrian use. A number of our trails do allow horses and are used for equestrian use. So it can be helpful to be able to classify out different levels of use that might relate to things like conflict if you have interpersonal conflict between different activity types. A new realm that we've been venturing into, which Anna has really taken the lead on, is vehicle counts. So we do have a number of parking lots. The way that our particular system is set up, we don't have a lot of roadways that we manage, but vehicle counters are a way of estimating use to area if your major inputs or your major ingress and egress is road based. And I'd say a lot of the US national parks, particularly out west, this is one way that they generate a lot of their visitor use numbers, is by counting the number of vehicles that come into the park each day and applying a person per vehicle correction factor for that to estimate use. The third class, which is not a counter directly in itself, but is something that we've begun to explore, is the use of cellular location data. Both trail counters and vehicle counters, right? You got to pick a spot, and Anna will go over that a little bit, some of the considerations for where you're going to place them, but they are a point count, whereas what we've started looking at with some of the cellular location data, it's the stuff that's usually embedded in apps and embedded in lots of apps that just sort of reports locations back. It's usually it's anonymized, but you can often get a device identifier, and so you can start to see patterns that people are taking across the system. You can filter it down, or you can summarize it by unique device IDs over a period of time to start getting a count. This is getting a little bit more into sort of sampling, though. We still have a lot of questions about how we can relate the sort of the locational counts to actual visits to an area. So not everybody has apps that report to the same services. But some of the early work we've been doing does maybe suggest that this might be one way of being able to at least do relative comparisons between areas, that if you've got twice the location pings in area A versus area B, that area A is in fact sort of receiving twice the level of visitation as area B. But for the remainder of this section, we're going to focus primarily on trail and vehicle counters. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of some of the major equipment options that you'll have to consider. All of the counters that we've used, whether they're trail counters or vehicle counters, generally you have some options in count types, binning, there's some operational costs, and there's some data management costs to consider. So the count types are generally dictated by the sensor that it's using. In the case of a trail counter, that would be a single sensor, and so regardless of what direction somebody is watching, it just registers it as a count. Some of the new eco counters that we've been using, those can do directional counts, so they can actually classify what direction somebody's going, and then, as I mentioned, multimodal. So not all of ours are multimodal. Also, not all of our trails are multi-use trails. So, but on the ones that are, we're able to classify between bikes and pedestrians, and that has been helpful recently, particularly as we've seen growing use or changes in use in certain parts of our system and not others. And this helps us understand if that's maybe because of different types, and maybe because of more bike use in an area, or bike use is going up relative to hiking. Some of the other considerations are how the devices bin the data. So as I mentioned, some of those early wildlife counters would just register a timestamp every time they made a detection. At first glance, that may seem like it gives you really great high resolution data, right, that you can simplify anything down to. In practice, the downside of that is that because it's not making timestamps when it's not making detections, this is equipment. It's prone to issues now and again. And if you're not registering counts, do you know that that's because it's really not detecting, because nothing is walking by, or because the counter isn't working or the counter got blocked? So a lot of times these counters will let you select sort of bin times. You can 15 minutes, an hour, a day, and what it does is it sort of counts up over that period of time. At the end of that time period, it writes a record with a timestamp and tells you how many counts you got and in what categories. So a lot of our stuff we do at the hourly level. That seems to be a good balance of both memory capacity. It's also sort of the most realistic level that we sort of tailor any management action to, right? We generally want to know if we need to start doing active if we need to have staff out on the system at once visitation reaches a certain level, right? Or we're thinking like the time of the day, and most realistically, that's going to be sort of in hour increments that we're making that decision, not really down to the minute. But you can also go all the way up to a day. Maybe you have an area where you're not really concerned about resolution beyond that point. It's just a really remote area, and you want to know if it's getting on what days it has visits. Maybe it doesn't even get visits every single day. Operationally, these equipment options vary in cost per unit. You'll have to consider what types of power sources you're going to be using. We generally tend to use ones that are battery powered. And if you're going to be looking at batteries, you're going to want to understand life. The more sensors you add onto these things, the faster it'll eat through batteries. If you've got a really, really remote location that you can't get to very often, probably longer battery life is better. If it's something that you just drive to the trailhead and you can swap out batteries every couple of months, maybe that's not so much of an issue. Download method is definitely a consideration. This has gotten better over time. A lot of the counters that we have now, you can connect via Bluetooth so you can just use a smartphone app. Others may come with a specialized dock, or some of the older ones that we even had a big download unit and a cable, and those could be a little finicky. So think about how you're going to actually get the data off. The final thing I'll touch on is data management. So just thinking a little bit up front about what sort of format. These are the benefit of counters is that they can collect a lot of data over a long period of time. The downside is they generate a lot of data, and you're going to have to do something with that. So when we did our visitation study a few years back, we had about 60 trail counters that we were rotating all over the place. That becomes a pretty big data management endeavor with hundreds of thousands of records. So you just want to have a plan for keeping all that sorted. How you're going to do the analysis. Some of these platforms have integrated analytics packages that you can use online. Those tend to be fairly simple in looking at frequency, just sort of basic frequency distributions. They may allow you to apply correction factors. They may not. This is fairly straightforward data. You can really actually do quite a lot even in Excel, but you can also do a lot by importing it into more robust analysis packages. And then wireless connectivity. So some of the newest counters that we have actually have cellular connectivity, and they're able to transmit data every morning. So it's not quite real time, but we get a daily update of counts from the previous day. Not surprisingly, those units cost more, so we don't have nearly as many of them as the little mobile ones that we can move around, but they have given us some capabilities for sort of understanding more frequent updates at some of our most popular locations. So with that overview of sort of the options for the equipment, next we'll go into, if you picked what equipment you want, understanding where advantages and disadvantages of where you might install it.
All right, thank you, Colin. And so as you said, I'm going to talk a bit about overall just where to put equipment once you've selected it. And so we're going to use this fun theoretical open space map here, the Woods open space, to go over some examples. And again, as we've said a few times, your setup is going to affect or be determined by your management questions. So some of the main considerations you'll have is, do you want to know how many people are visiting your system as a whole? Are you concerned about a certain trail segment or a destination? And so visits, trail use, destinations are sometimes the same, but often cases they're not. And so that's going to dictate where you end up putting a counter. So if you want to understand visits to your whole system, you'll probably be installing these units near the access point. You want to make sure that you're isolating the main access trail to make sure the counts are linked to the trailhead that you're interested in. So you can see the kind of parking areas and beginning of trailheads are highlighted on the map there. And you can see the little bars are before the trail diverges. And so here you're just getting one count to people going on starting their trip there. On the other hand, you might have other areas where trails converge. You can see this if there's a lot of different access points or people are taking shortcuts that lead to a main trail. And so in cases like that, you'll want to make sure that you're installing after those trails come together. And then as mentioned before, a vehicle counter might be the best choice. And as Colin mentioned, this makes the most sense when there's one road that goes to many different areas and you're not as concerned about specific trailheads. It can work at some parking lots. I'll talk a little bit about situations where that can and can't work on the next slide. All right, another situation that you might be interested in is a trail segment. So you can see the little green trail highlighted there. This can make sense if you want to get a better understanding of how much people are going on an interior trail, or if you have trail design or maintenance concerns, or if it's a trail closure and you want to see how much people are complying with it. That could be a good option for that. So it'll tell you the boots on the ground and how many people are using it, but not a great measure for how many people actually visit the trailhead. And on a similar note, you might be interested in destinations. And if that's the case, it makes sense that you'll want to install the counter as close to the final destination as possible. If it's a long hike, you don't want to assume that everyone who starts at the trailhead makes it to the destination. And you also need to consider different hiking speeds and don't make any assumptions about how much people use any of the interior locations. Just because there's a lot of counts at the trailhead doesn't necessarily equate to how dense the trail is later on. All right, now my quick aside about parking lots. So the one on the left there is an example of a trailhead that we have where a vehicle counter works really well. It's a long, pretty straight driveway-like road there. Vehicle counters don't work very well if cars are parked on top of them, or in the case of pneumatic tubes, if cars are turning, the wheels will trigger multiple counts. So straight, access like that is ideal where cars aren't probably going to be backed up and parked on top of it. In a slide in the middle, so this is an example of another trailhead that we have, and here a vehicle counter is not going to work. We could put one on the main road, that could be an option, but this particular road goes to many different places and many of them are not our property. And so this is where we got creative, and I'm glad we had a discussion about cameras earlier. We're doing a big parking study right now at all of our trailheads. And so we got creative and we figured that a camera here was the best option. And so we have it on a timer to take pictures in a set amount of time. And then we have to go through and code all those and count how many cars are parked there. It's not ideal because it takes a lot more time, but it seemed like the best option for that particular location. And then in that third photo there, if anyone's been to Boulder or looking through some of the comments, I see some of you are from Boulder. You've probably been to Chautauqua to visit the Flatirons. And so this picture here is the main parking lot there. And at the circle at the front, at the top there, it looks like it could be tempting to put in a vehicle counter there, but it's a really short access area. Cars are going to be turning, they're going to be parked on top of it. And same with the bottom circle there. It's a bit longer, but it's a popular spot. So cars are probably going to get backed up. They're going to be parking on it. And it's just a high traffic area. And so it's more likely to get vandalized in an area like that. It also doesn't work for cameras. We would need probably 10 of them to try to cover all the spots unless we could get a good aerial view like that. So cameras weren't a good option here. So again, we're combining different methods that we've already talked about. And here we're combining observations with trail counters. And so we have people go out and do a manual observation where they count how many cars are there. And then we're pairing that with trail counter data. So we can predict how many cars are parked there based on the trail counts. So just a quick aside about how parking lots are super fun. All right, now diving in a little bit deeper, we're going to talk a bit about placement in the field. So some things to keep in mind with trail counters is to make sure that they're not pointing at the sun. A lot of the trail counters, at least the ones that we use, are infrared. And so sun pointing directly at the scope is going to give you some erroneous counts. For placing on the trail, narrower trails are generally better, especially if people are forced to travel in a single file. Then you'll get one count per person, hopefully. And then try to be discreet when possible. You don't want people to think it's a camera and dance in front of it. That'll get you some erroneous counts as well. And at the same time, you want to be careful about hiding it in a tree or somewhere with a lot of vegetation. Branches blowing in front of it can trigger counts or also block counts. And right now we have a lot of grass growing, and so we're doing checks at all our counters to make sure grass isn't growing in front of the scope. And finally, with trail counters, you want to avoid gathering locations. So if you want to get access points, like I said before, you want to install it pretty close to where people access the system, but still don't point it at trash cans, trailhead signs, where people might gather to wait for other people in their party. It's better to install it a bit down the trail to avoid getting extra counts that way. With vehicle counters, as I mentioned, a long straight stretch of road is ideal. You can install on both paved and unpaved for the buried inductive loops. Those are intended to be longer term, kind of semi-permanent installation. So they take a lot of work on the front end, as you can see there. But they can be installed for longer, which is an advantage for those. And then road tubes, as you know, I'm sure you've driven over some of those. They're intended to be installed less permanently and intended for paved roads. They can get cut up pretty easily, and it needs to be on solid ground without any mud or anything. And finally, with vehicle counters, and a big lesson learned for us is to avoid floodplains. Especially with the more semi-permanent installations, it's tempting to install them underground in an irrigation box. But keep in mind that the box can still get flooded and equipment doesn't usually like to get wet. So it can malfunction if you do that. All right. And then I think I'm passing it back to Colin after this to start getting into the fun data that we can get from installing these counters.
Yeah, so we thought it might be, before we go into some of the specifics about calibrating and dealing with some of the data, it might be helpful to see a slightly less theoretical example of what you can get off of them. So a lot of the data I'm about to show you comes from the last sort of system-wide visitation estimate that we did, but we're going to break it down here and show you what you can sort of get with different levels of sampling. So if we're talking about general temporal patterns, as I mentioned, a lot of what we do, we bin it into hourly periods. So that can give you a pretty good sense of how visitation is distributed across the day. This particular graph is showing how sort of the percent of visits that we get across hours of the day for the entire year, but that can be broken down much more discreetly, and we'll show that in the next slide. So if you're just trying to understand how use is distributed across the course of a day, right? You can sample a matter of a couple of weeks. Depends on the confidence you want, the level of variability you have in visitation. Again, being a municipal proximate open space, a lot of our visits come locally, and so a lot of those patterns are mostly dictated by weather. But as far as when people go out and how frequently they go out, they're fairly stable, or at least not the level of variability that you might expect to see at a state park or a national park. So anyways, if you're trying to understand distribution over the course of the day, you might be looking at sampling for a few weeks. Similarly, if you're trying to understand how things are distributed across days of the week, you might be looking at doing a couple months worth of data collection, so that you have a large enough underlying sample for each day of the week. You could also, of course, classify that by weekday or weekend, depending on how much variability you see there. If you want to understand how your visitation varies by month, then obviously you need to go for at least a full year, if not multiple years. In this case, in the last 2 decades, we've had the opportunity to do a full year's worth of data collection twice. Towards the, well, or I guess I don't have it later, we've recently moved to collect our entire system was a matter of, we've got almost 200 access points, just because there's a lot of neighborhood access points, and as in that map that Dion showed at the very beginning of the presentation, sort of the entire city is surrounded by trails. So we've got a lot of places where people can access, which meant we had to rotate counters across a lot of locations. What we've started now is we have 11 locations where we have trail counters installed in essentially a semi-permanent permanent sense, where at least for those locations which are collectively somewhat representative of our trail system as a whole, we'll be able to start seeing how things change on a year-over-year basis. So the great thing about these count data is that you can really start exploring some more detailed temporal patterns here. So on the left-hand side there, this is looking at sort of percent visits by hour of the day and comparing weekends to weekdays. Remember on that previous slide, you could really sort of see that distinction between weekdays and weekends. But we can also look at seasonal differences. So down there in the green is summer, and for many weekdays, you can see that it's sort of got this bimodal distribution where we got a little bit of peak in the morning, and we've got a peak in the afternoon, sort of more once everybody starts getting off work. You go to the winter though, even during the weekday, the days are shorter. Oftentimes people might be waiting for it to warm up a little bit, so that peak use goes more towards the middle of the day. So you can start maybe imagine how some of this might play into deciding both how you need to allocate personnel. So maybe it's you've got rangers and they're trying to figure out the best times to go out and do patrols, or you've got outreach staff or maintenance staff. Maybe you're trying to look for the lowest use periods of time because those might be the good times to go out and do some maintenance. That graph on the right there, it's a bit more complicated overall, but what we were looking for here was we classify our trails into sort of 5 use categories, and they've got defined ranges which equate to the average the average number of daily visits that location gets, and it goes from very, very low to very high. And what we were curious was sort of how sensitive is it to when you measure those during the time of the year. And what you can see is that you tend to get a little bit more variability during those summer months, but, and this was a bit of a surprise for me at least, that generally visitation goes up and down within those classes. What we don't see is a whole lot of sort of crossover from one class to another. And so this at least lends for us suggests that if we're trying to figure out how busy a trail is, we don't have a big risk of getting it wrong just based on when we assess it during the year. Finally, if you're able to collect trail counts across enough locations, either concurrently or consecutively with some sort of sample methodology, you can start to look at things like spatial patterns. So you might be able to start understanding sort of high visitation clusters, which may be a function of the number of access points you have in the area, or you might have just a couple of access points, but they're really high use areas. And so you might be able to start understanding how people are distributed across trailheads. You can also look at the relationship of access points to trail miles. That isn't displayed directly on this map, but through some of the other work that we've done with understanding trail densities within certain areas, you can start to understand, do you have 5 trailheads that are giving access to 10 miles of trails versus you may have another spot where you have 1 trailhead that gives access to 20 miles worth of trail. So you can start to understand, and that might play into just sort of opportunities that you might be managing for. And then finally, you can look at activity types in relation to access. And so we're able to do this in some circumstances more directly through those multimodal trail counters that are able to differentiate between bikes and pedestrians. But what we also did during this study is we ran this alongside our visitor survey, which included questions about the activities that people were doing. So a lot of the locations where we were doing trail counts using automated counters were quite proximate to where we were also conducting surveys. And so we're able to understand counts and the survey data on a paired location by location basis. And so that can help us start extrapolating other characteristics from the survey in relation to the use levels. So with that overview of sort of what you can get out of it, there are a couple more steps to make sure that you can get reliable counts, and Anna will go over those.
Thanks, Colin. So yeah, I'm gonna go over some steps on how to get to those awesome graphs. And it can be a little windy sometimes to get from counts to visits, but with keeping a few steps in mind, it's not too difficult. So depending on how long you have the unit installed, you're probably gonna have some missing counts and some invalid counts. And so one of the first steps is to find out which ones are missing and invalid. Missing should be pretty straightforward. Invalid counts can be a little more tricky. As I said before, there could be leaves blowing in front of it, or sometimes the units just go haywire and they'll just have some crazy high counts. Or if something's blocking the unit, it'll still be functioning, and so it won't appear like you're missing any values, but you won't be getting any counts when you should be. So a few options that can help you identify primarily invalid values is we used an impacts calendar where we just tracked things that could impact use, whether it's a trail closure or an event or a really, really nice day or a really crummy day. We just have a calendar that we can refer back to just see if anything was going on at a high level, and then just do some manual review to help us determine if the count is valid or not. You can also kind of come up with a rule. For our big visitation study, we used 20 times the median. So any count that was more than 20 times the median was flagged, and then we kind of checked on it to verify that it should be included or excluded for those high counts. And then once you identify those, you'll have to come up with a plan to replace them. If you're just missing an hour or two, it could be pretty straightforward. You could just take an average of the hours before and after. If you're missing much more than that, you can replace with some other daily or seasonal average, depending on what type of system you're dealing with. And then we have our calibration adjustments. So the counter is always counting, but it's not always accurate. So the counts are still valid, they're just off a little bit. So I'll cover calibration a bit more in the next slide, but that's a really important component. And then finally, you have your adjustment factor. So a really simple scenario is you just have one trailhead, there's one place for people to enter and exit all from the same place. Even in that case, everyone's probably counted 2 times because they're entering and exit from the same spot. So to get the arrival departure adjustment, we simply divide all the counts by 2. It gets more complicated if you have a poor system or people can enter and exit from different locations, or they do a loop or something before they reach where the counter is installed. If you have a directional sensor, that can help, and you can use the directionality to help you get your adjustment factor. And then once you get all that, you have your estimation of visits. That's part of the path that we took. Then I'll do my little aside about calibrations, but it's not really an aside because it's a really important part of getting count data. So the counters are probably just off. And if you see like in the trail there, which is Chautauqua going up to the Flatirons, it's a pretty wide trail and people are walking side by side. Chances are a counter out there is going to undercount. It's gonna count 1 person when there's 4 going next to each other. It can also undercount if people are going really fast. For example, if you have bikers, or with a vehicle counter, if cars or vehicles are passing over at the same time, it might undercount those. That being said, they can also overcount. This can happen if people or vehicles are moving really slowly through the detection area. It might count them twice. Or at places with lots of dogs. We try to install counters at waist height, so they'll miss a lot of them, but they can still capture them. And all of this is okay as long as it's consistent. And so how we figure that out is we get a calibration data sheet, kind of like what you see in the top left corner is what we've used. And we do 3 3-hour sessions for a total of 9 hours for each counter. And we just have someone sitting out there and they just simply compare how many people passed by with how many were actually counted. And for a trail counter, we look at different user groups, if it's hiker, runner, biker, dogs, so we can try to figure out what's going on at a site-by-site basis. The good news is we've learned that it can be pretty consistent. And so in this graph here, you can see the observed versus counter detections for Chautauqua Trail, the one in the picture. And the dotted line there is what we would have if we had a perfect one-to-one relationship, which we didn't, but you can see with the line there and the little gray shaded area is the 95% confidence interval. And it's pretty narrow and a lot of the dots kind of fall along that. And so that gave us our calibration factor to apply to our counts. All right, and then some lessons learned for our counters. As I just said, wide, high-use trails can be okay as long as you calibrate. If it's not a high-use trail, you may have to target busy times or sit out for longer to get enough data for that. The next is you need to do equipment checks. It's pretty amazing the number of things that can go wrong or that can give you erroneous data. As Colin mentioned before, it could be batteries dying or it could be light going in the scope. Vandalism, people stuffing leaves inside the scope. We put placards on saying that it's not a camera, it's just a counter, in case that's what's upsetting people, but sometimes people just want to vandalize what's out there. You can also get insects that like to build nests inside the scope, like you can see in the top right corner, that's a spider nest. We recently had wasps in there, which luckily didn't affect counts, but it made it a little more tricky to count on. And at least in our system, we've learned that cows like to use them as a scratching post. So we have some high counts when cows were in the field. So that's another thing to just watch out for. The next point is that you can't automate your way out of looking at the data. And so we have this fun graph at the bottom here, and you see the really high count there. This is from February 2020. you might be tempted to exclude that. It looks like it might be an outlier there, but that was actually just a really nice day out. And it also happened to be Super Bowl. So people either going out before the game or just avoiding it altogether. We just had a lot of really high counts that day. And the bar right after it is also valid. We had a really crummy cold day that day, or people recovering from the Super Bowl. It was just a really low use day that day. So our kind of local knowledge of the system and what was going on and situations helped us determine that those are valid counts right there. And the last point here is to scale the effort to the management goals that you're trying to address. So we did this really intensive year-long system-wide effort where we did the surveys and encounters, and it was a lot of work, and it gave us a lot of really great data and a really good baseline. Moving forward, we're going to start doing some smaller scale efforts and more regional, just so we can get more continuous data collections and kind of be a little more nimble and provide more frequent updates. But the scale of the effort just applies to your staffing, your scope, money, and what you're able to handle and manage. And we're back to questions.
Yeah, so with all that, if anybody wants to dump any questions into the chat or unmute themselves, we can field any questions.
Yeah, it'd be fun to see some faces too.
Yeah, I'll pause the screen share for a moment and put the video back up.
Good stuff. Raymond.
But if there's no questions, we can jump on to the next section. Here we go. Expand on the cellular location counters. Do you want to?
Yeah. So this is some work that we've just started doing recently. There are a few companies out there. Typically, what they have is they have location reporting services built into a lot of apps. I don't know what the incentives are for certain app developers to incorporate this location tracking into their apps. The one that we've been using says that they've got their sort of location reporting services in a couple thousand apps, which equates to about 500,000 sort of user base in Colorado. If that's equally distributed, that means like 9,000 to 10,000 in the Boulder region. So they can provide different products. We have been looking at what they call their device level product, which essentially gives us an anonymized device ID and then location pings or reports. And they've got some different ways that they filter it, but some of the work that we've been doing, you can in fact take a specific device ID and see a route that they took through an area. You can take a section of trail and you may need to buffer it a little bit, but you can then extract maybe data for data for that within that spatial buffer, summarize it by the unique number of device IDs. And so what we're trying to see now, because we do have some trail counters out, is I see Dion's comment here that I may be totally off topic on this question, but anyways, that we can take those, and we're trying to see if we compare a couple areas where we do have our current counters, does the cellular data actually compare in terms of relative visitation levels. So in case I may have been totally off topic on this, and you were in fact asking about the wireless transmission, our trail counters. Those basically just have cellular chips in them, and each morning they transmit the previous day's worth of counts back to a cloud service. We can access that data directly through their web interface, but they also have an API, and we've just started working with our IT department to get that data pulling into our local one of our local databases, so that we sort of have a more granular access to it. That includes an annual data plan. We're essentially paying for the connectivity. So it's not, again, it's not pocket change, but compared to the number of people that we would need to pay to sort of go out, download data, constantly be uploading it, it does have its advantages, and it actually has allowed us to automate some of it, and I'll show you some of the visualization work that we've done with that. But we have been able to roll out some publicly accessible products, so that for these locations, people can go and look at what use was for the previous day or going back in time. Anything else? All right, well, again, feel free to just paste any questions, even if they come up later in the comments. We've got just a couple of short sections left, so should we jump right into those? Cool. All right, so now we've presented a few different methods. We just sort of wanted to recap this with some of our more broad lessons learned on developing a research and monitoring program. Sometimes research and monitoring is the same thing, sometimes it's not. Often what we've found is that what started off as research has, for us, sort of evolved into monitoring. We do a big effort, we collect a lot of data, and then all of a sudden people are looking for an update on that, 1-2 years down the road. So we'll start with the research side of things and sort of how we set those priorities. I'm the one giving the presentation on this, but all the credit goes to Dion, because she had the vision of how to set up this program. So first thing you want to do, if you are an agency yourself or assisting an agency, is you want to look and see what existing guidance is out there. So do you have established objectives for the agency? Are there any guiding principles? Why does that management agency exist in the first place? We have a lot of we have sort of a pretty diverse set of guiding principles. We have obligations, enabling legislation that says that we're protecting natural ecosystems, we're providing passive recreation, we also have a lot of agricultural management objectives. So we want to look at all of those and understand, first, what are we legally charged with doing, and then beyond that, maybe you have existing plans which say that you're trying to target certain objectives. Next, it's a pretty good idea to start outlining some themes and questions. You can't, or I'd say likely you're not going to be able to tackle everything at once. There are time constraints, there are resource constraints on your staff. If you're talking about survey research, you know, and you're surveying the public, right? You don't, in this day and age, and probably many people on here have felt it, right? It seems like you're getting hit with a survey every other day from somebody. So there's not the bandwidth to be able to ask everything all at once. So if you sort of outline themes and questions, you might start seeing how some things could build off one another. So we've got a almost decade-long sort of research timeline laid out. It doesn't mean that we're going to get to everything on those specific days, but it sort of gives us a guide of where we might go, so that when it does come time to submit project proposals, even internally, we're able to say, okay, this next project would help build on what we know and set us up for something else down the road. What's known, you know, as a program, as a human dimensions firm, we've only been around for about 5 years now, but that doesn't mean that nobody was doing visitation related research prior to that. So it's always important to go back and look at what's been collected in the past. It may not always be up to the standard that you might be hoping to approach it for designing a new research project, but you shouldn't discount it either. Know what applications you have. So this is a big thing for us. We work with a lot of universities, and we certainly fund a lot of just sort of intellectually interesting questions, but we also definitely have an obligation to evaluate the success of our research based on sort of its application in a management sense. Success for us is not just finding statistically significant results, it's finding results that can have a measurable impact on management or policy creation. And then finally, it's just a matter of capacity, understanding where you are now and where you might be able to grow in the future. So our team has grown over time. In large part, that's sort of come from slowly building our capacity internally, demonstrating the utility of a lot of this research. Couple quick points on the differences of research versus monitoring. You won't always know this up front, but you might start to realize this over time. I'd say back in 2005, which was one of the first times that we did a combined survey and visitation estimate component using trail counters. At that point in time, it wasn't really thought that this was something that was going to be continuously repeated. That was viewed more as a research project. Over the process of conducting surveys periodically on a 5-year basis and now collecting more visitation count data, it certainly started trending, and that's what gave support for establishing an actual monitoring component to a lot of that trail count research that had been done previously. Though of course, you got to think about capacity and funding. Monitoring means you're sort of committing, if you want it to be useful, you're committing to doing it periodically. So ensuring that you have the funding and the capacity, right? That's where you might consider, are you going to have more capacity in staff time, or are you going to have more capacity in funds? Sometimes those are related, sometimes not. Whether something's exploratory or a new topic, we definitely do a lot of in-house research. We also collaborate a lot with universities or do funded research. We have a funded research program too, which is sort of a small grants program where we're able to, we put out some topics and people are able to apply. Oftentimes they may be grad students and it's a little pot of money, and right, they're able to get a project. They're also able to explore something that we really don't know much about, or we certainly don't know enough about to launch a full-blown study of it yet. Data deadlines. This is a big one. Are you trying to collect data that's going to set sort of 20 years worth of policy, or are you trying to collect data that's going to inform what to do next year versus this year, or in the fall versus right now? So understanding where you are with that. And then snapshot or comprehensive. This comes a lot to capacity. If you're looking at a small area, so maybe you've got a plan for a redesign of one particular area of your system or region, you may need to collect a little bit of data on there. That can certainly be pretty critical to figuring out some site-specific issues, but at the same time, if you're only ever looking sort of too narrowly, it may become hard to understand what's going on as a whole. So having some sort of comprehensive baseline to assess that against can be quite helpful. I guess one specific example I'll mention is maybe you have one trail and you do monitoring 1 year, you wait another 5 years, you do another count, it looks like things have changed a lot. This is a question that's come up for us. Did it change because that year just happened to be a little bit better? The weather was nicer when you went out, or is that how the trend in fact actually was going? So having a little bit more comprehensive baseline to assess that against can be helpful. I won't go into the weeds on all of this, but just some key lessons that I wanted to point out with data analysis and scientific computing is that it's great to be able to collect lots of data, but eventually you realize you're winding up with a lot, and if you don't have much of a plan for how to keep it all organized, it can become a little overwhelming itself. And the existential question may be, if you have lots of data but no way to interpret it, is it actually useful information? Save the raw data. A lot of this just comes from actually a document called Good Enough Practices in Scientific Computing, which I highly recommend. Save the raw data. If you clean it up, that's fine. If you do transformations, that's fine. But keep a copy of the raw data so that you know how you got from the start to the end. Create the data you want to see. This is both for other people and for yourself. Make sure it's comprehensible. Make sure you can understand it. If you're using coded values, at minimum, make sure that you have a document, that metadata that shows or that tells you what those coded values are. Storage is cheap these days, and even an even better approach is just write the actual values in it. If it's a yes/no question, recode it to yes/no instead of 0 and 1, and then nobody has to guess what it is. And if you come back to it in 5 years, you don't have to guess what it is. Create analysis-friendly data. Oftentimes, the easiest way to enter data into a spreadsheet is not what's most preferable for a lot of analysis software. If you ever come across things that talk about converting from long to wide format, sort of this is the realm that it's in. Recording the steps. The most intensive way of doing this is you can write a document, right? Just detailing things that you did to clean up your data or restructure it. If you're using a more code-based platform like R, you can insert comments into it, or Python, you can insert comments directly into it, and it sort of tells you, you can tell yourself. It's nice that it's self-documenting in that way. Keep files organized and naming files to reflect their content. This may not seem like one of the most major things of research, but I will tell you, if anybody is going to come pick up your research, or you've ever been in this situation of trying to build upon something that somebody's worked on before, naming files to reflect their content, you know, if it's a data set, if you're talking about Chautauqua trail counts from 2020 and that's all that the file contains, call it something like that, Chautauqua trail counts. Don't call it, you know, Collins in progress May analysis, and then down the line that ends up being the most complete data set that you have. Nobody's going to know to look for that down the road. So those are just a couple of the key points that I wanted to highlight on sort of keeping yourself organized. And the last thing I'll end on is something that I think all of us know, but I'll say certainly in sort of a policy and management sense, it's not good enough just to have good data. You have to help people understand it. And the most precise tables in the world with all the statistics don't mean much to policymakers, or people who just have a lot of information that they've got to process. At some point, your data is going to move into that policy realm. It's going to become more subjective. Doing as much as you can to help people understand it, to simplify it, to visualize it can be really important. So we've started getting a little bit more into this, just using platforms that can turn it from that big tabular data into visuals. There are lots of great graphical products out there. Our lesson learned is that your best bet to have somebody look at it and pay attention is probably a bar graph. Sadly enough, there's a lot more interesting graphs out there, but bar graphs at the moment seem to be the most widely interpretable graph out there. So if you do go to osmp.org and search for Data Explorer, you'll probably be able to find this one on the left. This is actually the daily update of our fleet of 11 trail counters. Sort of automate some of that plotting process. This other one is not publicly accessible. It's internal, but it's way we've been able to start looking. One of the big differences with these two COVID-related observational studies is that where most of our studies, we had the, I'd say, luxury of collecting a bunch of data and then doing analysis and then sharing it out. We've sort of got this live study going on now where every 2 weeks or so, we need to give updates to management about what's going on. And so taking a little bit of time up front to automate some of that reporting process has made it a lot easier on us on a every 2 week basis. So that's sort of an overview of some of the major things we've learned, and I'll pass it off to Dion to just do a couple slides on wrapping us up.
All right. We thought we would end with a couple of slides related to how we've used all this information that we've collected over the years. The graphic there being the front page of our master plan that was just adopted September of last year. It's our most recent guiding document. If you remember a few slides ago, we learned that guidance is often coming out of plans or approved documents of other sorts. And so we're going to run through how we've applied visitor count, visitor survey, various sorts of data that we've presented today. Could you click? I believe this is animated. So as I mentioned before, maybe I didn't, maybe it was in the chat. One thing that we tried to do in the beginning as a human dimensions team, we've only been formally together for a handful of years, is create a baseline knowledge of the various things going on the system, kind of the who, what, why, when, where, and how many of recreation in a public land setting. Having baseline data is going to help you create a shared understanding, kind of as the bottom line, like everyone agrees, like, yes, this is happening, this is where we're starting, we'll continue monitoring over time, but at least everyone can get on board with a shared understanding of what's happening at a point in time. It's also been very helpful to ground anecdotal beliefs. As I mentioned quite a few times, we haven't been around that long, so open space has been around for more than 100 years. There's a lot of different beliefs out there related to what's been going on related to visitors and our pet friends. And so having systematically collected information and then visualized in a way that the public and decision makers can consume is great at grounding some of those myths that are out there related to visitors on your system. Another big thing, staffing a budget request. So everything that we do, of course, takes time and money. There are a lot of teams that we support out on open space. I think right now we're in the 120s with standard ongoing positions or FTEs, full-time employees. Having real information related to visitors and where they're going and when, how they're distributed, what services they're using, kind of all of that will help support any staffing and budget requests you have for particular teams or times of year. We do have 200 plus additional people that we bring on every year, seasonally or less of a year, maybe even the whole year, even though they're temporary class to support various operations. All of that can be supported by your systematically collected data that you have across your system. Again, reminder that map up there showing, I believe that's showing counter stations. Colin, correct me if I'm wrong. So we have all this count information. We also collect the visitor survey and all the direct observation that we do collectively that gives us a really good picture of what's going on. And we can direct those staffing and budget requests to any location or any point of time where we have collected that sort of information. And then if the real time information can also be used to support infrastructure development. We have so many access points. We have, I think, close to 200 access points, many of which have developed infrastructure, such as that picture you see there. Parking lots, trash cans, visitor kiosks, all of that can be supported by real information regarding, again, how many people are there, what they're accessing, or what they may need that you don't yet have there. The master plan, as I mentioned, was adopted last September. It's the first time since 2005, when our very first visitor master plan was adopted, that we have updated system scale guidance related to the provision of passive recreation. So a lot of our information is going to go to support the implementation of that master plan. Over there on the right, you'll see a little snapshot. The highest level or the top level priority that we have coming out of the master plan is to assess and manage for increasing visitation. Because we have been counting people for many, many years, we know that visitation is increasing. And so given limited time and money, the master plan provides guidance on where we should place our limited funds and people. So all of the HD data that we're collecting can support the provision of, in the end, I'm guessing everybody on this call, you're somewhere that doesn't have the time and money to do everything. And so the master plan is the way that we go about prioritizing how we disperse our time and money, and the HD data supports all of that. And then we have daily operations, which never go away regardless of where people are coming from or what they're doing, or if they disagree about everything that you're up to. All of that doesn't matter. Trails still need to be maintained. The rangers are still patrolling. We have educators and outreach staff out with interacting with the public. We have to do basic things every week, like outhouse maintenance and trash service. All of that can be informed by visitation levels and, again, service provision preferences. And then right now we're at the point in time where we have been collecting enough visitation data. Since 2004 is about when the first system scale study occurred. So we're starting to have a pretty longitudinal understanding of distribution and change over time. And again, the master plan was adopted in 2019. With our 2005 visitor master plan, there was a 14-year gap there in guidance related to visitor management strategies. And so things that we're looking to now, knowing what we know about visitor distribution, are integrated transportation design, as well as potential new things such as activity separated trails or access limitations. Things we've never really dove into in the past, but now we have hard data to support such measures if we choose to do so. Next slide, and this is the last slide that we have for today. Just wanted to provide one small case study from one cyclical and repeated survey that we do, which is our resident survey. I think Heidi mentioned one mode of survey administration is mailer, which is the current, or I should say the last implemented method for the resident survey in 2016. Going back in time, this has been the repeated survey instrument where we've asked all the things in that list there were potential visitor use management actions at the time that they were asked of the public. And all of those in that list, permit program, voice and sight, trailhead leash, parking fees, wildlife closures, muddy trail closures, undesignated trail closures, and on-trail regulations with the correlate creation of habitat conservation areas. All of those were asked within the resident survey over time, and we did gain public acceptance of those as management strategies, and they all, right now, today, live and exist on the program. I'm sorry, on the system. And with that, the last slide, you will never get away from the perception. Everyone has their perception of what's going on, your public, your colleagues, your neighbors, your family, your board of directors, other people in the world are gonna have an opinion about what's going on in your system. And it's very, very important to remind people that the plural of anecdote is not data. I think Colin found this quote, but it's awesome because people will come to your public meetings, they will write you comments. Even internal to ourselves, we are constantly up against the perception that, well, I saw this once, or I see it every Wednesday, or I see it, you know, this or that. But having systematic data collected across your geographic scope in the course of a year or whatever your study period is can really, really help ground some of that anecdotal information that people want to base their decisions on, but probably shouldn't. And with that, we have a couple online resources here. We do plan to send this slide deck out or make it available to people, so nobody needs to worry about writing any of these down. But generally speaking, we have our Open Space and Mountain Parks website, and then within that you can find all of the publicly available reports that we've put up there as a Human Dimensions research unit. And then a lot of what we do right now, some of you may be familiar with the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council. They've put together some cross-agency across all the big federal agencies nationally, monitoring guidelines and visitor use management guidebooks that you can find at that website there. And last slide, please. Our personal contact information, and thank you. And I believe we have, I know the plenary starts in 5 minutes, but if there's any last minute questions we can respond to in the last 5 minutes, we can do so.
At this point, if there are any questions, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask questions.
Yeah.
I've got a question going back to Likert, using Likert data. So if it's problematic to compare the means, what other strategies can you use, you know, beyond just eyeballing the totals?
I think what we were saying there is because Likert scales are often ordinal or categorical or some other situation where there isn't a known variance between response 1 and 2. What you can do is report their frequencies within each one of your categories and try to understand it that way, or maybe bin them into like acceptable or unacceptable if you have a midpoint, or maybe you have a unipolar scale going one way, like those that didn't think it was acceptable at all to those that thought it was moderately to most acceptable. we tend to not use the means on, you can, it's just not the best way to represent the variance in a Likert type of scale.
Yeah, it's certainly used sometimes, and I think I may have posted a response to this. Certainly if you're trying to do modeling, certainly when it comes to trying to assess attitudes, if you're working with something like theory of planned behavior and you're trying to understand behavioral intentions as a function of sort of the attitudes and preferences going into them, you may need to go that way. In some cases, very very specific questions and scales have been better demonstrated in the literature. Typically, I'd say we tend to err away from that if we are using, if we've developed the question, it's not something that's been asked a lot as part of a published theory, and we're just using, I mean, we've got some reference documents for Likert scales that we may use as the anchor points, and in those cases we typically just report frequency of them.
Yeah, another problem with using the mean, if you're trying to understand the level of whatever it is, importance, quality, acceptance, problem, if you use the mean, it's going to mask those on the low end and high end, and it's going to look like maybe everybody is near the middle, when in reality you might have a good bit of your sample on either side of the scale. And so reporting the actual frequency of either side of the scale is going to tell the reader a much richer story than having the average or the mean point in the middle, which would mask over the variability at either end.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So do you have any advice for presenting data to city councils or citizen advisory boards beyond everyone likes a bar graph?
Oh boy.
I mean, you got to tailor it to your audience. If you're having a general reporting session and maybe your council or board doesn't have the ability to understand higher level statistics, in my opinion, there's no sense presenting it that way. We do always bring along or have available our technical report, which is going to have higher level analysis included in it. For general population sharing and for those that tune in to our city council and board meetings, it's just not helpful at that kind of the general world that's coming along or viewing from home or comes in person. Our board itself, not everyone has the ability to understand something you might want to present or that is the best practice for representing that type of material. And so we present something that we believe the most people can understand at the time. And if the questions come up, we almost always have higher level things hidden from view where we could describe more in depth whatever the question is.
Yeah, I was trying to think if I had any expansion on that, which is generally that certainly as the person doing the analysis, I find lots of things that I think are interesting. What I've found most helpful is to really run it by somebody who is not been part of the project. In fact, I have one colleague, and he's always very good about asking the question when I say, "Oh, and look at this result," and he says, "Okay, why do I care about that?" And trying to get into the habit of constantly asking that question. Okay, well, why would somebody care about this result? And sort of helps start filtering out the stuff that's maybe not quite so important to present up front, but also just thinking about the the why, you still want to keep it as objective as possible, or at least I do, and not assume that somebody is trying to make a decision one way or the other, but it is, I've certainly found it helpful to start trying to think through, just view it through their terms of, okay, well, why would I find this interesting? How is it going to influence a decision one way or the other? And then I think the other key thing that I've learned is that context is, we always try and provide context. We always try and explain the nuance, but just remembering that there will probably be one number that's remembered at the end of the day. So just as an example, our visitation estimate has some confidence intervals associated with it. I guarantee you there are probably no more than 3 people who could tell you what those upper and lower bounds are are to the estimate, right? Everybody's going to remember the average, or remember they're going to remember one number. And so just trying to keep that in mind, that that's the reality situation. So if somebody's going to walk out of that presentation remembering one thing, what's the most important one thing that they remember?
I think we're at time, and
Yep.
the conference program has started.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
That was really fun. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for your help, Rena.
Enjoy the plenary.
Thank you.
All right, thanks a bunch.
Thanks.
Oh, okay. I guess we're ending here. Bye, y'all.
Bye.